Coming up in today's podcast.
This is a step too far. It's time to get off the crazy train.
Yeah.
And so, this is for the people, especially for the insiders that are listening to this now. If you're reaching this point where you don't believe in it and it doesn't make sense, and you think it's time to take a step back, and then you say, but how can you walk away on 200 years of the testimony? And it's like, it's not. Like, every step of the way for 200 years, people have been saying, this has gone too far, this is not okay, it's time to take a step back and walk away. And you are just the latest in a long, long passion of people raising the alarm.
Of thousands of people raising the alarm and thousands of people doing the same thing. You're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not, you're not, on a flight of fantasy. It just might be that actually you're the one who's seeing things really clearly.
Yeah. And it's just not talked about, right? Like, that's the thing in there. The most that they have to glean any kind of hope of change is Aberdeen, right?
Welcome to the Get a Life podcast. Explore survivor stories. Uncover the hidden truths. Join our X-Cult conversations. You matter, and so does your story.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Get a Life podcast, where we shine a light on the hidden stories of those who've escaped coercive control and high-demand religious groups. I am Cheryl, and I'm an ex-member of the Exclusive Brethren, now known as the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, from a tiny town in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan in Canada. Before we get to today's podcast, I would like to reach out to every ex-member of the PBCC and anyone who has been a part of a high-demand religious group. There is a very important survey that you will see here that will help many of us that are battling and fighting for justice in the courtroom, as well as helping to create new laws against coercive control. The data collected here is completely confidential and anonymous. If you haven't watched podcast 115 and are unsure about this survey, that podcast will answer all of your questions. We are very much in need of all the ex-members of the PBCC to fill this out if you haven't done it yet. The link will be in the description below. Today, I am so thrilled to have Craig Hoyle with us, author of the riveting memoir, Excommunicated. We are joined by his cousin, who is also an ex-member of the PBCC and runs a charity to help those leaving any high-demand religious groups called the Olive Leaf Network. Welcome, guys.
Hi, good to be here.
Craig's journey out of this cult is one of immense courage, emotional upheaval, and ultimately freedom from a cult that doesn't believe in being gay. His story not only captures the painful reality of being cut off from everything you've known, but also explores the deep personal discovery that comes with reclaiming your life and jumping into those dreams you weren't allowed to have. What makes Craig's journey through his book, Excommunicated, even more fascinating is his in-depth exploration of his ancestry. We'll be diving into Craig's experiences, the challenges of leaving, and how uncovering his roots helped him piece together his identity after the cult. We are going to do this podcast a bit different, and Craig is going to take us through the book chapter by chapter, so those that can't read it inside the PBCC can still reap the benefits of this incredible book. I read it in a weekend, couldn't put it down, and my mind was blown reading it. Craig, you are a magician with words, and I hope you inspire many other ex-members to write their own stories. As we discuss here on the podcast, these stories and memoirs are so important to be recorded. We live in a time now that allows truth to come forward in ways it was never allowed before. I truly believe this is how we are doing what we are doing. There are many people leaving now, and it's books like yours, Craig, that give so much solace and insight. What a crazy ride this has been for you, though. Your book is pretty much launched everywhere, I believe now, right? September 6th was North America. How are things going since the first launch for you?
Good. It's been a wild ride. The book has it's been much more popular than even the publishers were expecting, and it's on to its third print run now.
Oh, wow.
The first print run sold out, so they did another one, and that one sold out. So on to a third print run now, and Something that's really exciting is we've actually just signed a deal with a TV production company that want to explore turning it into a TV series.
Oh,
Um,
wow. That would be great.
yes, yes. So there's been a lot of attention, and it's been quite strange for me because um, I don't know what I was expecting. I thought that people would be interested in the book for a few months and then it would all go away. And that hasn't been the case. And I'm still being invited to all sorts of different events and festivals. And for the next year, like I've just had invites through for March next year as well to go to WOMAD, which is an arts and music festival here in New Zealand. Um, so yeah, the attention has gone on for a lot longer than I was expecting.
Is you know what though? That book was so easy to read. And so like you were just flipping through the pages as fast as you could. So like I can see why it's on its third print.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And a big shout out here too to Lindy as well, who read it all while it wasn't in as good a state as it is now. Um, where you went, because I mean, this is our family, and one of the things that I was super cautious about is when you're representing not just yourself but your family, it's really challenging and like, am I getting it right? And um, you want to be, I think you want to tell the truth about what's happened without being overly critical. And so Lindy was a huge sounding board for me, being like, am I being unfair to our great grandparents here?
Also, it's incredibly complicated to try and, as you say, accurately represent people who are still on the inside. And you've obviously had to change some names to protect some people's identity, which some people queried me about. They were like, who's this person? Like, I've never heard of that name before. But yeah, for any listeners who don't know that, some of the names were changed to protect identity. But yeah, I think that's an incredibly complex thing that you've done, is not only trying to tell the stories of people who are deceased and historically part of this story, but people who are still alive, who are still in the Brethren, and people who are out of the Brethren, and trying to, as accurately as possible, represent their stories at the same time as it's very clearly your voice and your story and your perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, and especially when knowing that those people on the inside are going to be angry no matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have to thread, like, it's such a delicate path to walk, representing them in a way that is fair and comes across as fair to other people, while knowing that they're still going to be angry about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's no way that my parents will ever be happy with the fact that this book exists, no matter how fair I feel I've been to them. But for me, it was really important that other people who have come out of the Brethren, and also for people who are still in there, can read this and say, yeah, that rings true, that happened to me, or I can understand how that would be true. And that's particularly challenging as well when you're writing about those older generations, like our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation. They're still alive, and so it's a huge swing to describe their experiences and what the Brethren were like in their childhood and through their formative years. When I wasn't there personally, and people who were there are still alive. And it's still one of the things that freaks me out, is the idea that people will come out of the woodwork and say, I was there in the 60s, and that's not what it was like. And so that was a really careful process for me of making sure that as many people as possible read the manuscript or read different parts of it to check that I had it right. And it's really small details, things that aren't necessarily recorded in official Brethren history. And I, like when I described how the Brethren women started wearing scarves, and I just said, oh, well, they put the thing on their head and they tie it behind their heads. And someone who read one of the earlier manuscripts was like, actually, when we started wearing scarves for about the first 18 months, they were tied under our chins, and then it moved to being tied behind our heads. And I would never have known that detail. But for someone who was there, if you get a tiny detail like that wrong, it really stands out.
Yeah.
And
Craig, that is another thing that is a huge strength of the book, and kudos to you for this, because this book is deeply personal and intimate, and it's got your personal story in it. But yeah, equally, like just as powerfully evident is that there's history woven through it, and that's, as you said, it's been incredibly fact checked. It's very true to what did happen. As you said, you've got multiple different people to check it from multiple different generations and historical archives, and that's, I think, huge strengths of the book. There are many memoirs out there, and quite a number now from ex-brethren, and there's a real range and quality to them as well, and content, and some of them are really highly personal, just about that person's life and their emotions and their immediate experiences. And that's fine, that's one category, but the huge strength of your book is this incredible attention to detail spanning decades and decades. It's a phenomenal piece of work.
When HarperCollins originally approached me about writing this book, and they asked me to write it, I didn't have any burning desire to write a book, actually. But they reached out and I met the commissioning editor. And initially they wanted me to write a book just about my story. And I said no, because there are a lot of personal stories out there. And I said I am just the result of what happened to my parents, and they are the result of what happened to their parents. And sort of without thinking it, I started thinking about it. I gave the commissioning editor this like big lecture about 200 years of my family history and what had happened with the Brethren, and how you couldn't understand my story unless you understood this 200 years of history. And then they came back and they're like, why don't you write a book about that? And I was incredibly lucky that for 200 years, because our ancestors were involved from the very beginning days with Derby, and they all kept records of what they did and what they thought and why they did what they did. And so Lindy and I are the 7th generation that were involved with Brethren. And of those 7 generations, the first generation joined. And then there were another 3 generations in the middle that also left, but a generation would leave and the next generation would come back. And so for 200 years, it's been this like really personal, really damaging conflict of going in and out and in and out and in and out. And everybody believed that they were doing the right thing. And it's only sort of when you look back at it with the benefit of 200 years of hindsight that you can see how incredibly damaging it's been to the family, and then how this is just a microcosm of the Brethren movement more widely. And then you think about all the terrible, terrible harm that's been caused by these practices and how it really has been going on from the very beginning.
I think that's what made this book so different, though, right? Because it was such a different memoir to read. Like, it was so different because it was just so much more than your own personal story. Like, the roots to it gave it such heart. Like, you're sitting there. I mean, I think part of me got healed just reading it, right? It was just, there was so much heart in the way that you told it. I think it was just so fantastic to read.
I'm very pleased to hear that.
It was just incredible.
I say to a lot of people that I don't see, obviously I've written it and a lot of it is my story, but I think more broadly, I wanted the book to be our story. And it should be something that speaks to anyone who's come out of the Brethren, and more broadly, anyone who's come out of any controlling environment, be that religious or otherwise. And I'm really pleased that it's having that reaction with people, because I never wanted it to be just my story.
Yeah, well, you've achieved that. Yeah, you've achieved that.
Achieved that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I mean, and I know I've had firsthand encounter with insiders who would love to have it in their home, but, some of them still live at home and they just don't want to be caught with it. It's just too risky, right? Especially those that have to wait for a certain age to leave, or those that are just, not married yet, or not wanting to get married and biding their time on leaving. And I think that's why I really, really wanted to do this podcast differently than probably the ones that you've done. So yeah, why don't we start with this? Do you want to start with the very beginning?
Sure. So for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, this is what the book looks like. That is
For those that can get it, go get it. I'll put a link below, especially for the ones in North America now that can get it. Yeah.
Awesome. And just to explain the cover, so that is me when I was, I don't know, 12 or so. And then the two, this is my grandparents on their wedding day, and their wedding picture was cut in half after my grandpa was withdrawn from. And so that's why that picture has been torn apart like that. And the idea with the design was to show the history and also the fact that families are being torn apart. So that's what the cover's about. And we were thinking that we would work through, we'll just go through the book chapter by chapter, and I'll read out a few pages from each chapter, and then we'll just chat about it as we go along.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Shall I read the bit, because it's a good summary as well, just to give a big overview at the start. I mean, we kind of already have, but given an overview, but let's do that because it's quite succinct. So on the back, good old back of a book, it's always useful to look at that. It says, after coming out as gay, Craig Hoyle was excommunicated from the New Zealand Exclusive Brethren and forced to say goodbye to his family forever. The conservative sect was everything he'd ever known, a childhood where television, pop music, sports, and even pets were against the rules. Joining public society, the worldlies, for the first time, Craig sets out to meet his grandfather, who had been excommunicated in the 1980s. And then, using his diaries and letters, uncovers 2 centuries and 7 generations of his family's tangled and often cruel relationship with the exclusive brethren, or the brethren, weaving their past with Craig's own upbringing in this secretive and oppressive religious group. Excommunicated charts the evolution of the exclusive brethren in New Zealand and the heart-wrenching stories of a family torn apart. So this is a summary of your book, but also on the inside cover, Craig, it gives a wee summary of who you are now, which I think is important as well. So it says on the front cover, inside of the front cover, Craig Hoyle grew up in Invercargill within the New Zealand Exclusive Brethren. Separated from public society, he attended Brethren-only schooling and worked in his family's tyre shop. After facing interrogations and conversion therapy for his sexuality, he was excommunicated from the Brethren and lost his family in 2009. Today, he is the Chief News Director for the Sunday Star Times in New Zealand. He has worked for newsrooms such as TV3 and Radio Live, and behind the scenes on current affairs shows, including 60 Minutes. He lives in Tamaki Makaurau, Aotearoa, which is Auckland, New Zealand. So, Craig, that's a quick snapshot of who you are now. You're still the Chief News Director for the Sunday Star Times, aren't you? So, no doubt you're a busy man. That must be such an intense role. And yeah, you enjoy living in Auckland. And I understand you live just down the road, actually, from the main Brethren meeting hall, which is quite funny, really.
Yes, I drive past it almost every day. And I thought long and hard about moving to this part of Auckland, and then I thought, bugger it, why should the Brethren determine where I live?
Exactly. Good for you.
Yeah. So there you go. There's a wee bio. That's a wee snapshot of who, very brief snapshot of who Craig is now and of the book. So let's go ahead and unpack the book. Craig, do you want to start us with the prologue, which kind of sets the scene, doesn't it? And then begin looking at the chapters with us.
Sounds good. What I'll do is I'll read a few pages out from each chapter as we go, and then we can chat about them. So the prologue is where the book begins, and it sets the scene, and it starts in Invercargill. Grandma Edith shook with wrenching sobs as we stood on her doorstep. It was only the second time I'd seen her cry. The first was when she'd received news of her mother's death. This was so much worse. I knew that after this goodbye, I would never see Grandma again. Edith had tried to keep it together when I arrived at her house that overcast Saturday afternoon. She was speaking with another Brethren woman at her doorstep, and I stood to one side as their conversation wrapped up. Grandma broke down as soon as we were alone. She wept as she said she wasn't allowed to welcome me into her neatly arranged home. She had been told I was about to be placed in the first stage of excommunication, which meant she had to sever contact. There would be no cup of tea, no biscuits, and no loving conversation at her kitchen table. Her soft woolen cardigan and curled white hair stood out sharply through my own tears. I told her I wasn't officially excommunicated yet and begged her for one last hug. Sobbing even harder, she threw her arms around me. This was the last time we'd embrace, the last time she would speak to me without fear of retribution from the church, and the last time I would listen to her hearing aid beep because I had my head in the wrong place as we hugged. Edith, my dad's mum, was heartbroken. She spoke of how the devil kept taking away her family, her grandfather, her parents, her husband, and two of her children, and now here I was, the first grandchild she would be forced to disown. How could the devil be so cruel? But it wasn't the devil who was forcing us apart, it was the exclusive brethren. On that Saturday in Invercargill, a blustery city at the southernmost end of New Zealand's South Island, I walked away from a brethren family history that spanned 7 generations and almost 2 centuries. I was 19 and life in the church was all I had ever known. Like my parents and their parents before them, I had been born into a system that demanded loyalty and obedience. To walk away was an act of desperation, but I knew it was the only way I could ever be true to myself. And that is where the book starts and sets the tone for how it continues. And it was really important to me to start the book with a scene like that, because I think for all of the discussions that we have now, what it really comes back to is that we've been ripped away from our families, and for as much as we can get over it or learn to live with it, it's that absolute cruelty of those separations, like when we're very first ripped away from our family, and that I think is the deepest trauma that never leaves us.
Yeah.
I had a insider send me a message, it was a couple weeks ago, and it was, came into the reading today. The brethren doesn't split up families. God does.
Oh my gosh.
That was
Are
recent.
you kidding me?
Mhm. It actually made
I mean,
me cry. Like I actually cried after I read it and was just like, only because, right, our families are still in there. And if they're teaching this stuff, I mean, before it was, it's just the way that they change their narrative to fit what they need, right?
Yeah, that's so true. I was speaking with some people yesterday about the realities of spiritual abuse and religious trauma, and I was saying that it is, it's psychological abuse and mental abuse and emotional abuse, but it's got this extra layer because it's done in the name of God, that the people who are doing it use the concepts of the divine or of sacred text or the Bible to sanction it and to justify it and to even make it a good thing, which is exactly what you've just described. It's horrific.
Yeah.
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 Okay, so that's the prologue, which, and it goes on. It's got several more pages that explain a wee bit more, doesn't it? And that are just as full on. And the prologue finishes by saying, my life as I knew it was over. And I think that's something that, again, every former member of a high demand religious group or every former member of the Brethren absolutely knows that statement in the depths of their bones, that all of us have reached a point where my life as I knew it was over.
Yeah. And it's such a bittersweet moment, isn't it? Just like watching these people that are leaving now, right? Full families coming out. And it's such a bittersweet moment of knowing that you're gaining that freedom that you've always wanted, but then your heart is being ripped out because you're having to leave behind the family. Yeah.
Yeah, and you never get over that.
No, you don't.
For as much as we,
Yeah.
you can learn to live with it, but it never goes away.
Yeah.
So after the prologue, we move into chapter 1, which goes through parts of my childhood. And so I'll start with the beginning of chapter 1, and then there's a second bit that's sort of related that I'll skip through too quickly. During the summer of 1998, when I was 8 years old, my 5 younger siblings and I clustered excitedly beside the kitchen bench as Auntie Sophie plugged a cassette player into the wall socket. It was a sunny afternoon, and we'd been racing up and down on the flying fox Dad had built for us in the backyard. We were streaked with dirt and grime, keeping us all clean was a tall order, and I scuffed my toes across the scratched linoleum as a tape clinked into place. This was a big novelty. We weren't usually allowed to listen to music, and we didn't even own a cassette player. This one was borrowed from an older Brethren couple around the corner who used it to listen to recordings of church services. I wondered if they'd have loaned it to us if they'd known it would be used for playing music. According to Mum, just this once we could bend the rules, but it was best we didn't tell anyone. Sophie had found the tapes in a cupboard at home in Wellington and brought them with her on this visit to Invercargill, but she hadn't told me or my siblings what was on them. All we knew was that she and Mum clearly thought they were important. To me, they were even more exciting than the flying fox. I was amazed that entire speeches and songs could be stored on thin strips of plastic film. Our lives were almost completely free of modern technology, so this was an eye-opening window to another world. As my auntie hit play, the tape clicked and whirred. A hush fell over the kitchen. Then a soulful melody began, like nothing I'd ever heard. The notes of an instrument swooped through the song. Mum and Sophie explained it was a Hawaiian guitar with a small steel bar used to pluck out the gliding sounds much loved on the islands. I closed my eyes and imagined a tropical beach with palm trees and scorched white sand. And then an astonishing revelation. The person playing these otherworldly songs, Mum said, was her own mother, Grandma Lottie. I stared in shock. Lottie was deeply religious, even by Brethren standards, and I couldn't fathom her being behind something so beautiful and exotic. Sophie explained that Lottie had a complicated relationship with her beloved guitar. Although she loved playing it, she worried her music was coming between her and God. At one point, she feared her guitar was becoming an idol and stopped playing it for years. In the cassette recordings, she wasn't performing alone. A man whose voice I didn't recognize was playing the piano alongside her, their voices raised together in song. Her accompanist sang in a rich baritone, and their harmonies tugged at the heartstrings. A faraway look crossed my mother's face. Our auntie warned we needed to be careful that Grandma Lottie didn't hear the recordings. They'll make her cry. And the subtext becomes clear later in that chapter as the recordings were of my grandparents playing together and my grandpa had been withdrawn from. And so we weren't to let Grandma listen to those recordings, because if she heard her and Grandpa playing together, it was too much of a reminder of what had been lost. And just picking up on that music theme, a few pages on, describing the...
That actually makes me feel so sad because, you know, they were, I obviously didn't know your grandmother so much, but they, like, this is about George, yeah? Or if it's okay to give that away, but yeah, he was an amazing musician and he loved to sing and he had a wonderful voice. And yeah, that just makes me feel so sad to think that there's this recording, this snapshot of a couple together sharing their beautiful love of music together. And, you know, there's a recording of this moment. And then, yeah, all that like pain and division and separation to come to, you know, to never sing and play together ever again. It's a heartbreaking picture. No wonder they didn't ever want your grandma to listen to them, because it would have been just so painful for her to remember that togetherness and beauty that they did have.
And just on that togetherness, I think that segues nicely to this next bit, which is just short. Mum had a honey-coloured guitar and would sing us to sleep after we'd been tucked in. This was pretty much the only time we heard her play. She was usually too busy in the kitchen to get her guitar out at Brethren's social gatherings. One of the songs she strummed was Hank Thompson's 1956 country ballad, The Blackboard of My Heart. The chorus mystified me when I first heard it. The singer talks about his heart as though it's a blackboard that once had "I love you" written on it. Now his tears have washed the words away, and it's too late for him to write them there again. At the end of the song, Mum stopped to answer my questions about blackboards and explained how chalk could be dusted away. She leaned across for a reassuring hug and told me, The words I love you are written on the blackboard of my heart with permanent marker and can't ever be removed.
Oh,
Um,
beautiful.
and
Yeah.
I think that speaks for itself. And
Yeah.
this was there was so much love in our family, and so many things that were messed up as well. But there was this outpouring of love from people like my mum and people like my grandma. So much love to give, and a lot of it was expressed through music like this. And it wasn't until I became older that I realized there were these incredibly dark undercurrents through it all. And we'll just carry on to the end of chapter 1, I think, which ties those pieces together. As I grew older, I started to connect the dots. The man we'd heard in Grandma Lottie's recordings was the mysterious George to whom I had been compared as a child whenever I was being rebellious. I learned that he had been Lottie's husband, which made him my grandpa. He was Anna's younger brother. Anna is Lindy's nana. George had been withdrawn from when my mum was 13, and she hadn't seen him since. This explained why Lottie lived without a husband and might cry if she heard the recordings. Even worse, George was against the Brethren, one of the terrible opposers we kept hearing about. He had dared to challenge the elect vessel's authority. We were told he had hurt Lottie deeply and abandoned the family. George loomed in the distance as an evil person who shouldn't be talked about, a story that made threats of excommunication seem very real. I imagined what might happen if I met a similar fate. Be careful what you say, I told myself, or you might end up like George.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting reflection there that you've captured, that you were aware of thinking even as a young age, because yeah, one of the things that I've learned a lot about in therapy, especially over the last few years, is around concepts of attachment and in families, you know, how do you have secure attachment and anxious attachment and avoidant attachment and all that sort of thing, that in this knowledge that it's so important for us to know that we have loving bonds with people we can trust around us. And, you know, that story of your mum saying to you, you know, I've written I love you on the blackboard of your heart and that can't ever be erased. That was a beautiful description of a mother, you know, trying to affirm to you that she was going to be there for you no matter what. Like, what a precious memory that was. And yet at the same time, you know, at the end of the chapter there, you're reflecting this growing awareness as you grow up that actually sometimes people do get scrubbed off from the blackboard and that they disappear. And that is also this weird reality, as you've said, there's this beautiful love and bond, and at the same time, this awareness that we all grow up with, knowing that sometimes people disappeared, and that if you were naughty in some way or stepped out of line, and like you said, you're never too sure what it really was about, because often we weren't told what people had done, but we just knew that they had disappeared. That's an awful reality of what it's like growing up in the Brethren, starting to learn these factors.
You're being promised unconditional love, and then at the same time realizing unspoken that there actually are all these conditions.
Yeah. And it's just, I think our mothers and our parents have very, very good intentions, right? But with how heavily indoctrinated everybody is, we do become a death to them. We become completely written out of their lives. And I think due to the indoctrination that they're all under, that really happens in their brain, right? We're not spoken about. I mean, when Richard first met me, he had no clue I even existed in my family, and he had stayed with my family. You know, I had somebody else reach out and say that no, there's no Cheryl that was ever here in Maple Creek, that this isn't true. There's no Cheryl. I mean, she wasn't from the locality of Maple Creek. So it's one of those things where you sit back and it's heart-wrenching what you've got to think, especially a mother who gives birth to a child and then eventually has to allow the memories and the interactions and all of the things that they gave to that child literally die within their soul. It's so sad. Like, I mean, we go through what we go through, but just imagine what our parents must go through as well.
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, and especially for a lot of us who chose to leave, I mean, we had an element of choice,
Yeah.
and we can at least, I know for myself, I can live with the consequences of those choices because I knew and still believe that it was the right thing for me.
Yeah.
But I look at someone like my mother who had no choice. You know, all of this separation, all of this heartbreak has been really, as I see it, forced on her. And when you don't have that choice, it's a lot harder to live with the consequences.
Yeah.
And so I think moving on to the next chapter, and the sad thing here is that there can be a lot of love in brethren families, and there can also be a lot that's not so great. And this is what chapter 2 starts to deal with. Watching Dad as I grew up taught me that violence was how some things got dealt with. He thrashed me and I lashed out at my younger siblings, a horrible cycle where punching and kicking was the ultimate demonstration of anger. One afternoon, when I was only 8, a petty sibling dispute boiled over soon after Dad got home from work. Angered by his heavy-handed attempts at justice, I screamed at him, "Fuck!" I had never sworn in front of Dad before. Swearing was a terrible yet exotic thing done by worldly kids, and I thought this word was the worst of them all. From the look on his face, it was as though the ground had parted for the arrival of the devil himself. I realized I'd made a grave error and hightailed it for the backyard with Dad, still in his work overalls, in close pursuit. I made it as far as the washing line before I tripped and fell. He closed in. I was used to being severely smacked, but this was different. Dad left me lying on the ground and lined up his steel-capped boots. Thud, thud, thud. I wrapped my arms around my head, sobbing and screaming as his kicks thumped into me. Later, bruised and terrified, I curled up in Mum's arms, crying as she tried to tell me that everything would be okay. Not long after that, a couple of Brethren kids came round for a play date. Childish roughhousing turned to name-calling, and I ran off and shut myself in my room. But Victor and Blake wouldn't let me get away so easily. They banged on the bedroom door, shouting taunts. Full of rage and with nowhere further to run, I opened the door, punched Victor in the face, and slammed it closed. I'd broken Victor's nose. There was no hiding what I'd done when he turned up at church in a face cast. Everyone saw me as a violent child, and I was marched around to his family home for a humiliating apology while our mothers made awkward small talk, pretended there was no bad blood. Nobody thought to ask what was going on in our home. It was just a black mark against my name, one that lingered for years. One of the many problems with beating your kids is that eventually they get big enough to defend themselves. As the oldest child, I was the first to put this to the test with Dad. He was slender and wiry, and at 10, I was solidly built enough to try my luck. Dad had chased me into my bedroom for a beating and was incensed when I dared strike back with a punch. Standing up to him was like dumping a jerry can of petrol onto a bonfire. Blows rained down indiscriminately, and in the scuffle we fell to the floor where we writhed around throwing punches. I wasn't quite big enough to match his strength, so I grabbed his pinky and bent it back as far as I could. In the heat of the moment, I figured breaking his finger was the only way this nightmare would stop. "David, stop!" Eventually, Mum's helpless screaming got through to Dad. Ashen-faced and panting, he rolled off to one side and looked at me in disgust. "We're going to have to call a priest." To me, this was the worst possible outcome. The intervention of a priest was the first step toward someone being shut up or withdrawn from. I was still under the nominal age of 12 for assembly responsibility, as it was known, but feared that wouldn't be enough to save me from public punishment. My fear of Dad was eclipsed only by my fear of being excommunicated, and I sobbed in terror as he went to find the phone. I would be the one in trouble. He was the head of the household, so I was supposed to respect his authority no matter what. "Please don't," I said. "I'll be good, I promise." When my tearful pleas fell on deaf ears, I ran sobbing into the night. Brethren discipline required a priest to first talk to the guilty party. Using my childhood logic, I figured that if he couldn't talk to me, I couldn't be shut up. I huddled, terrified, in a neighborhood alley in the dark, weeping as my mind churned through worst-case outcomes. How would I face the other Brethren kids at school if I was shut up? Eventually, I plucked up the courage to creep back through the streets and survey the family home. The coast appeared to be clear, so I snuck through the back door and put myself to bed. The next day, Mum told me it didn't look like I was going to be shut up, but she added that I needed to be a better boy. For weeks, I lived in fear that priests might change their minds. So this section was really important to me to include because I think it illustrates how messed up a lot of Brethren families can be, and it's not talked about. There's whether it is violence or whether it's sexual abuse or any of these like really, really traumatic experiences that children might be having, so often they were swept under the rug or the blame was pushed back onto the children, and all of the times where I was accused of being a violent child, no one ever, ever asked what was going on in our family. No one ever asked me why I thought violence was an okay way to deal with a situation. And when the violence was discussed, it was only my violence that was the problem because I was challenging the head of the household. His violence to us was fine, according to the priests. And so this was the undercurrent to a childhood in the Brethren, I think, is yes, there was this love and this warmth and being surrounded by people that you cared about. And there was also this really, really ugly side that wasn't talked about and that really fucked you up, if we're being honest. And I think a lot of us are still living with that impact now.
Yeah, that's so true, Craig. That brethren homes, for all their lovely, these days anyway, manicured gardens and their neat and tidy appearances and tidy clothes and all that kind of thing. The brethren homes are full of very similar types of dysfunction as can be found anywhere else, and some of it's physical violence, some of it's sexual violence, alcohol abuse, drug abuse. There's also huge amounts of mental and emotional and psychological abuse and control and dysfunction going on in marriages and families, enormous amounts of it that when you all sit together in rows in church, you don't see anything of it. And it's important to name that. It's important.
And to also could you imagine like having an 8-year-old kid who's been acting out, or to have someone come up to him and just say like, are you okay? Like, how are you doing? That was never asked. That wasn't something that was sat down with and you sincerely asked somebody, or a teenager that's acting out. Those are not words that ever would come out. And if they did come out, it always had this gaslighting element to it that was fear-based. It wasn't a sincere heart-to-heart conversation of like, what really is going on?
Yeah. Don't ask, don't tell is a huge subcultural motto of, the Brethren.
And just following on from that, and that whole don't ask, don't tell, in the way that nobody ever asked and nobody ever, we just swept it all under the rug. There's another few pages towards the end of the same chapter that I think flow on from this quite well. And a bit of context to this is that my dad struggled with depression through my whole childhood, so it was not an easy thing to be around. When I was 16 and in year 12, Mum spent weeks in hospital after surgery to remove her gallbladder. She'd been having issues with gallstones, and it all finally came to a head. I was struggling at school, acting out and talking back to the teachers, then driving to the hospital after class to pour my heart out to Mum. She lay pallid and grey in a surgical ward, yet still gave everything she could to make sure he was supported. Was she afraid of dying? No. If she was going to die, did she want us to call her Dad, George? No. I loved Mum dearly and couldn't wrap my head around how she expressed little affection for her dad, who at one point she'd loved just as much as us kids loved her. My 6 siblings and I needed our own dad to step up and make sure we were okay, but as Mum lay in hospital, he spiraled even deeper into his depression. One awful morning, he drove himself to exhaustion and collapsed again. This time, he crumpled in the kitchen, cracking his head open on the bench as he fell. My brother Caleb found him lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and once again, we had to call an ambulance for him. But this felt worse than his previous episodes. He'd never needed to be stitched up before, and now Mum wasn't there to pick up the pieces. Later that day, as Dad was treated at hospital, we heard that Mum was being rushed into emergency surgery again. There had been problems post-op, and her abdomen needed to be reopened immediately. The doctors said they couldn't guarantee she'd survive. I went through the day feeling numb, waiting for a phone call to let me know whether I still had a mum, and for that matter, a dad. What's a teenager supposed to do in a situation like that? How do you prepare for the possibility of becoming the eldest of 7 orphans? My teachers were as kind as they could be, but I couldn't properly open up to them about my trauma and grief because as worldlies, I felt they wouldn't understand. When Mum came home from hospital, she was bedridden, too weak to do anything more than watch as Dad's mental health continued to deteriorate. He shut himself in his wardrobe for days at a time, obsessing over books of Brethren teachings as he cried in the dark for God to show him the way forward. Occasionally he'd emerge and shout at us for not being well behaved. One evening he became very upset about us not eating dinner together as a family. It was difficult to get 9 people showered, dressed and fed simultaneously before the 7:30 church service. He demanded we all arrive at the table at the same time. We made it happen, no mean feat, and sat there expectantly, waiting for him to read the usual pre-dinner Bible verses. Instead, he stared at us blankly, then slammed the Bible down and shouted, "I can't do this." As he stormed back to the wardrobe, the rest of us ate in stunned silence. I was in an impossible situation. According to Brethren doctrine, Dad was still the head of the house, and we had to respect his authority even if he was no longer capable of exercising it. I couldn't understand where he was coming from or what he was trying to achieve. I was a headstrong teenager with issues of my own, years away from any empathy for the huge pain he lived with. I resented him for traumatizing us and for his double standards. If I lashed out, the priests got called, but if Dad lashed out, we had to submit to his authority. Dad became suicidal and talked about wanting to end his life. I remember at least one occasion when he disappeared into the night and Mum was distraught. We had no idea where he was. Had he hung himself in the cemetery, drowned in the river, or jumped in front of a train? As the eldest son, I was supposed to shoulder responsibility, so I took it upon myself to comb the streets of Invercargill, pushing aside a rising lump in my throat as I scanned parks and beaches for my father's body. I felt very alone on that late-night mission. The severity of Dad's depression was brushed over by the Brethren, and nobody offered to help me with the search. And that, I think, circles back round to what we were talking about the utter lack of support for people who are struggling with their mental health and the Brethren. And more broadly, how a lot of those mental health struggles were caused by the Brethren in the first place.
Yeah. Absolutely brutal. And very, very graphic, very beautiful, beautifully described, but graphic scenarios that I'm sure many listeners will identify with. Moments of observing family members in complete crisis and feeling completely alone because, you were alone. Knowing the Brethren, however well-meaning, some, run-of-the-mill Brethren person, couldn't help or didn't know, so they couldn't help, even just with acts of kindness, like bringing around a meal. The priests and elders can't help. So much of this stuff's totally out of their forte. I remember a family member of mine being in complete crisis, including with mental health issues, and the priest being counselled and being told that this person needed to read the Bible more, which, a bit like your dad in that moment that you described the family dinner table, this person was incapable of doing that at that time because their mental distress was so great, and that was not at all what they needed to be told to do. And then, we, like you said, we didn't feel that we could talk to teachers. They were outsiders and not to be trusted. When you're a kid, you can't take yourself off to the doctor, or even a teenager, and you'd be scared to trust the doctor. Like, where do you go? It's incredibly lonely.
And none of these things that I'm describing here were to do with me questioning the brethren. They were just desperate situations that we needed help with.
Yeah.
And the brethren just weren't there.
Yeah.
And I mean, later in that chapter, I go on to describe, I ended up talking to Ethel Green, of all people, about this. And of course, he's VDH's father-in-law, now died, but Ethel Green was a nice guy. But his advice was that I needed to step up and take responsibility for the family, and responsibility for the family business, and responsibility for my 6 younger siblings, and that I should be a father to my parents because both my grandfathers had been withdrawn from, and I was only 16.
Wow.
And this
The
whole
logical,
idea,
like the logic that happens inside a high demand religious group, right? It's so unrealistic. Right? It's just, that's the hard part of all this. And we see this now that we're out and we hear what happens inside there, and they don't understand what reality really is. Meanwhile, reality is happening inside there, right? I mean, your dad would have just needed someone to sit down with so that he could pour his heart out to them on whatever it was that was bugging him, but that would have never been offered. I mean, I can't remember of a time when I was ever in there where there was ever a moment offered to me to feel safe enough to be able to come clean with what had happened to me. Those moments don't happen.
And I think one of the things that, looking back, was really harmful was this whole idea of God only gives you as much as you can handle. And the more that's getting piled on you, that's just a reflection that God believes that you can deal with this. So the worse it is, the more God believes in you. And therefore, sort of by extension, if you failed to rise to the challenge of all of this trauma that was being piled on you, it meant that you were failing what God believed you were capable of. And it just meant that you were never able to stand up and say, this is too much, this isn't okay.
Yeah. It's like the bar is held here. Here is the bar. Everybody must achieve the bar, no matter what weight's strapped to your back. And if you can't, well, we'll kind of look the other way because we don't know what to do. And you just, you need to, hey, 16-year-old Craig, you just need to man up and parent your parents and the business and all of your siblings. It's,
And if it all looks like it's sort of rising much too rapidly, well, then that clearly means that God thinks the bar should be higher. So I think that for me, it was a complicated childhood, a lot of love and also a lot of pain, and very, very fortunate that there wasn't heavy drinking by either of my parents. I'm glad on that front, and also glad that there was no sexual abuse within our family. And I, like, for as much as these terrible things happened in our family, I recognize that being protected from those things was a really fortunate thing in a Brethren childhood. So the book, at this point, 2 chapters in, goes in a different direction. It starts going back to the history, describing Lindy and I, our great grandfather Sam Childs, knew the Darby and Wigram families back in England, back around London, and had actually known those families since before the Brethren times. And so when the Brethren came along, it was a natural fit. And I'll just read a section about Sam Childs. Samuel Childs, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, was a well-to-do businessman from London's merchant class. Born out of wedlock in 1787, Sam was an impressive figure with wavy black hair and thick dark eyebrows, exuding confidence in a gilt-framed oil painting he sat for in his late 40s. But for all his material success, he was a troubled man, preoccupied with whether God would judge him for the circumstances of his birth. His unease with his place in Christendom dovetailed with growing religious dissatisfaction in Britain and Ireland. Some Anglicans felt the Church of England had become stale, heading down the same liturgical path as Roman Catholicism. These protesters rejected the concept of organized religion in favour of a simpler ascetic faith, and they gathered for informal meetings inspired by, as they saw it, the Bible alone. Tormented as he was by church teachings on parenthood and legitimacy, Sam must have been relieved to find a community of Christians who had thrown out the old rulebook. Through the 1820s and into the 1830s, these freethinkers loosely coalesced, among them John Nelson Darby, the youngest son of the Darbys of Leek Castle. With his privilege, charisma, and piercing dark eyes, he stood out as a prominent voice. Fellow Brethren founder George Bycesimus Wigram was a family friend of Sam Childs. Darby and Wigram's group soon came to be known as the Plymouth Brethren in recognition of the rebels' early connections to Plymouth, a port city on the south coast of Devon. The Brethren movement spread rapidly, and sometime after 1841, Sam moved with his wife and the youngest of their 13 children to the Berkshire town of Reading in the Thames Valley. A Brethren meeting room had been established there in 1840, the Blue Room on Queen's Road, and Darby was a frequent visitor. Even in those early days, trouble was brewing within the group. Brethren followers argued over how to interpret and apply scripture, and a loose set of rules began to take shape. In 1836, the year Sam's last of 4 sons was born, a prominent Brethren member was concerned enough to pen a letter to Darby warning that if the group continued on its path, it would be consumed by doctrine and opinion. Darby, whose mysticism had taken a moody turn after he fell from his horse and suffered a head injury, paid the warning no heed. Tensions erupted in 1848 as the Brethren movement underwent its first bitter split. A comparatively liberal side believed it was acceptable to continue fellowship with other Christians who held slightly different beliefs, and this side became known as Open Brethren. The Darby and Wigram camp, meanwhile, believed in rigid enforcement of doctrinal boundaries and became known as Exclusive Brethren. Brethren gatherings up and down England were forced to choose sides, with friends and relatives cleaving over who was correct. This divide put the retired Sam Childs in a difficult spot. The 61-year-old had relocated to Reading, only for much of the congregation there to turn against his longtime friends, Darby and Wigram, by establishing an Open Brethren meeting. For Sam, a gruff grandfather with bushy white whiskers, there was no question about where his allegiance lay. By 1853, he'd given up on Reading and moved his household back closer to London. There, he set about constructing a home in Sunbury on land adjacent to Derby House, an estate owned by the family of the emerging Brethren leader. This was much more comfortable territory. And the reason I included this in the book and the reason I read it out now is because it was really important to me to demonstrate that this separation and this difficulty and this trauma that we're experiencing is not new. And this didn't just start in 1960 when separation came in. This was happening to Lindy and I's great-great-great-great-grandfather in the 1850s, where it turns out you're suddenly living in the wrong city to be part of the Brethren that you're a part of, and it ends up being more comfortable to relocate your entire family so that you can be in the right place with the right Brethren. And this is, I think, something that a lot of people don't quite understand. I think there is a bit of, there's a bit of sort of rose-tinted reflection on the fact that the Brethren were so much better before 1960. And in my opinion, and certainly from everything that we've gathered from going through 200 years of our family records, is they really weren't.
Yeah, I agree with that. There was, it was just recently, there was a bunch of stuff put out about JND, And I was talking to another ex-member about how we should probably do a podcast on it, because I think a lot of us have this perception exactly before 1960 that this stuff didn't exist, right? And then I started reading through a lot of these papers, and I was just mind blown at the complications and the thought, the way that John Nelson Darby actually did communicate his teachings, and it's very similar to what we have now. It was just done in a different context. Yeah.
Yeah, that's completely right. There are so many accounts of nothing to do with the PBCC now, the Exclusive Brethren, other Brethren scholars, Brethren historians of the wider Brethren movement, or of other religious, scholars of just other wider religious scene, who have got archival letters and documents and newspaper clippings and things like that describe how controversial J.N. Darby was. And, he's described by these other people as being a polarizing figure, being a person who divided communities with his, it wasn't just his beliefs and his doctrine, although it was definitely those were, an outworking, but it was his character as well. He was a polarizing character. Yes, he was obviously intelligent and charismatic in some areas, but he was controlling and ruthless and black and white, and those sorts of characteristics came through in his theology and his doctrine and his teaching, and they marked every Christian assembly that took leadership from him.
Yeah, and that then ended up having a massive impact on the Brethren in New Zealand, because the Brethren in New Zealand were started by J.G. Dick, who had been friends with Darby back in England, and then came out to New Zealand. He didn't agree with the separation between open and exclusive Brethren, and so he came out to New Zealand. And actually, we'll just read this bit from the book.
Yeah.
It'll be faster than me trying to explain it. So the context here is we're down another generation now. My great-great-great-grandparents had been missionaries to Jamaica and had helped start the Brethren movement there. Then they were back in England, and then after the death of one of their children, as he mourned his lost son, my great-great-great-grandfather threw himself into Brethren affairs back in the thick of things with Darby and Wigram in England. Disturbing reports were emerging of the wayward direction taken by the fledgling Brethren movement in New Zealand, a far-flung colony in the South Pacific where only a few decades earlier the Crown had signed a treaty with Māori tribes. Darby's friend and Brethren associate James Dick had shipped out there some 20 years prior, ostensibly for his health, although letters show he was deeply pained about the split between Brethren followers in 1848, and perhaps saw the new colony as an escape. Free from the watchful oversight of Darby and Wigram, Dick had set about establishing his own version of Brethrenism. A charismatic preacher with a long flowing beard, he drew large numbers from mainstream Christian churches, whose leaders saw him as a threat to their congregations. Dick welcomed all, never bothering to draw a distinction between open and exclusive Brethren. This worked fine for 20 years, but as shipping routes and communication improved, word filtered back to England of the freewheeling nature of his movement. Darby and Wigram grew increasingly concerned with setting New Zealand straight. In 1871, Wigram journeyed to the colony and undertook an extensive tour, trying to determine which Brethren meetings should be classified as exclusive and which open. He reported approvingly that the assembly in Christchurch appeared to have the greatest loyalty to the exclusive side, but he remained concerned overall by the lax approach taken by the New Zealand Brethren. On a subsequent visit in 1874, he fretted that the assemblies were being tainted by the heartiness and rough and ready nature of the society. It's little wonder then that Wigram and Darby sought to install loyalists among the exclusive Brethren in New Zealand. They needed devotees who would preach the correct, strict doctrine and pressure other members to toe the line. This was the perfect opening for William Childs, that's our great-great-great-grandfather, a proven loyalist with connections from childhood who had shown he was willing to depart for distant shores in support of the Brethren cause. And this really illustrates the the turmoil that was going on in the Brethren, and particularly in New Zealand through the 1870s, where Wigram literally came to New Zealand and travelled around all of these different Brethren meetings and essentially drew up lists and said, well, you're good brethren, we'll consider you to be exclusives, and you're not good, we'll consider you to be open brethren, and basically split all of these different churches and demanded that the ones that they considered to be exclusive stopped talking to all the ones that he considered to be open brethren. And so there's this massive separation and turmoil and sort of trauma that ran through this Brethren movement in the 1870s in New Zealand, as Wigram and sort of Derby controlling things from England, and then on a subsequent visit, were demanding this loyalty and demanding this adherence to this this division that they were insisting on. And again, separation, this was not a new concept. The idea of separation at some level had been there from the very beginning, and this is what Wigram and Derby were demanding of the New Zealand Brethren in the 1870s, was separation between open and exclusive, which was something that Dick didn't agree with, but in the end was forced to go along with.
Yeah.
It's just so interesting to sit back, right? And just listen to the words that are all being used. And it's fast forward to 2024.
There's nothing new about it.
No, it's not the same. There's just different world, right? With different control, with different tools that they're using, right? It's just,
And, you know, you've obviously been born and raised in New Zealand, so you're describing the New Zealand Brethren historical scene there too, but it must be the same for every country around the world where the Brethren are as well. There's these tales of families and power and politics and strong leaders bashing heads against each other, and the outfall of that on individual lives and on family relationships.
And just on the impact on individual lives, and coming down another generation, skipping through to the 1890s. This is our great-great-grandfather Fred. As I sift through our family records, I discover a letter to Fred from his sister-in-law Sophia 4 months after his wedding in 1898. Writing from England with loopy blue penmanship, she references the family's sadness that Fred's eldest brother has drifted from the fold. Poor Will, we must go on praying for him. He is missing so much. Sophia praises Frederick Raven's simple teaching and consistent preaching, although there's a hint that not all is rosy among his followers. How sad it is that he, Raven, has been so misunderstood. To me, this is familiar language. More than a century later, I was taught as a child that most people who oppose the Brethren just don't understand them. The supposed misunderstandings of Raven's doctrines prompted further divides through the last 2 decades of the 19th century as members left in protest. In 1890, Fred's missionary father was among a group at the Worcester Street Hall who rejected Raven's teachings, leading to a split in the Christchurch Assembly. But Fred, now married into a family of Raven loyalists, stayed true to the exclusive Brethren cause. And so we just see by this point, we're on to the 3rd generation of the family that's experiencing turmoil over what's going on in the Brethren, and there's these splits and these separations and these demands for loyalty. And you see family members that aren't part of that, the ones that have started to go off and do their own thing, are starting to be frozen out, and maybe contact isn't being cut off with them, but they're starting to be referred to in a different way. Sort of, you pity them, you feel sorry for them. It's clear that there's something a bit wrong with them because they're not performing to the same level of Brethenism as you.
Later on, towards the end of your chapter, the same guy, Fred, so that's your great-grandpa, right? Just to reiterate that.
Our great-great-grandpa, yes.
Yeah. So towards the end of this chapter, you describe a bit later on in Fred's life, and again, a fascinating letter that you, or a pamphlet that you got hold of, a historical 1. Not sure of the exact year that it doesn't say the year that it was written, but again, it's so amazing that you've got these historical documents. But you described that a London elder wrote a pamphlet and wrote it, and Fred probably would have received this pamphlet along with many others. But in it, this man called Mr. Giles, or Giles, I don't know how you say that, sorry, he warned about the exclusive brethren and said that under Taylor's leadership, the brethren were at risk of becoming, quote, a vast hierarchical system dominated by Taylor to the exclusion of any who cannot agree with him, unquote. And our great-grandpa agreed with this pamphlet along with many others. And many people, so-called in brethren speak, turned away from Mr. Taylor at that point, or set up a rival table, and all those kinds of divisions that happened over the years. And that was the language that was used for it was, and those who were still exclusive brethren, of course, had the view that we're the faithful ones, we're the remnant, we're holding on to the core truth. Whereas in everybody else's perspective, they were, barking completely up the tree, and that this profound exclusivism and polarization was actually very problematic and not in line with Christian doctrine and theology. So it's like just chaos.
For 200 years, very regularly, there has reached a point where a whole lot of people in the Brethren have gone like, this is a step too far. It's time to get off the crazy train.
Yeah.
And so, like, this is for the people, especially for the insiders that are listening to this now, if you're reaching this point where you don't believe in it and it doesn't make sense, and you think it's time to take a step back. And then you say, but how can you walk away on 200 years of the testimony? And it's like, it's not. Like, every step of the way for 200 years, people have been saying, this has gone too far, this is not okay, it's time to take a step back and walk away. And like, you are just the latest in a long, long passion of people raising the alarm.
Of thousands of people raising the alarm, and thousands of people doing the same thing. You're not alone. You're not crazy. You're not you're not on a flight of fantasy. It just might be that actually you're the one who's seeing things really clearly.
And it's just not talked about, right? Like, that's the thing in there. The most that they have to glean any kind of hope of change is Aberdeen, right? I don't know how I talked to so many insiders that are all waiting for an Aberdeen moment. They're waiting for this Aberdeen door to happen, because then it's an easy walk out the door, right? And so, I mean, this is so good the way that you laid it out in here, is because it really shows those inside that it wasn't just about Aberdeen, right? Like, for 200 years, this door has been swaying back and forth. It gets really full inside it, and then it opens up.
And by the time this happened in 1920 with the Giles division, it had been going on for 100 years already.
Yeah.
Like, there was already 4 generations of our family that have been pushed and pulled and torn in different directions by what was happening with the Brethren. And so, 1920 for us is more than 100 years ago now. But for the people living that Brethren experience then, it had been going on for 100 years before that.
Yeah.
And so the idea that any of us are just going to be able to decondition without doing some really deep work is unlikely or difficult. So moving on through the book, that's taken us to the end of chapter 3. And then chapter 4 moves forward a bit in time. My great-grandmother Ruth came out of the Brethren in 1920 with the rest of the family. And so she had a childhood in the exclusive Brethren, and then the family went to the open Brethren after they left in the Giles division. And she ended up meeting our great-grandfather Alf, who was also in the open Brethren at that point. He had grown up in the exclusive Brethren like her, and then had decided to break bread with the opens instead. And he was, through the 1930s, on the Chatham Islands working at the radio station there. And at this point, Alf and Ruth weren't officially together, but they were doing a lot of writing back and forth in the 1930s, and so that's where the story picks up. Alf and Ruth's shared exclusive heritage was a mixed blessing. His parents were still in the more restricted church, as were many of Ruth's uncles and aunts, and the couple faced ongoing pressure to return to the fold. When Ruth travelled to Ashurst in the summer of 1933 to visit relatives, she was interrogated by three elders about why she had deserted the church of her childhood. Alf was indignant. "My dear Ruth, what a battery you ran," and adamant he too would never return to a church that he saw as a pretty dead bunch. Besides, he added, even if he and Ruth were to be recognised as exclusives again, they would be promptly excommunicated for sharing communion with outsider Christians. If your dear dad came over and broke bread, we would be cut off, I suppose. And this is just to demonstrate the sort of the very strong them and us that was happening even then in the 1930s, which was still decades before official separation. And Alf and Ruth ended up married in World War II. They were in Palmerston North. Alf was in the Air Force at Milton Aerodrome there. But exclusive Brethren shadows were never far away. Alf's wartime stint in Palmerston North put the family within reach of their exclusive relatives, including Alf's father, Ernie, and stepmother, Kate, in nearby Ashurst. Alf and Ruth had mostly cordial relationships with these relatives, as contact between members and non-members was still permitted by the exclusives. It bugged Ruth that she and Alf still faced occasional pressure to return. In the summer of 1945, she described how her father-in-law had paid them a visit accompanied by an exclusive elder who recommended us to try them for a month. A few weeks later, Ruth visited an exclusive friend and was surprised when another exclusive woman arrived and pinned her in conversation. "I'd a talked meeting and justified their right position, and didn't I want to go back?" It was a relief when the host emerged from the kitchen with afternoon tea. And I include that just to demonstrate the pressure that was happening on people even back then. And we have this now with people who come out of the Brethren, and there's this massive pressure to change your mind or to go back, and this undermining of the path that you have chosen because you can't possibly be right. And just to make the point here that Alf and Ruth were not in any way inclined to go back to the exclusive Brethren, but they were trying to have cordial relationships with people who were still in the exclusive Brethren. And sort of the result of that was there was this constant pressure that they faced, this constant challenging of their choices, this pressure to go back to the true position, the right position, to be part of the one true fellowship. And I think there's a lot in there that a lot of people today will relate to. This is nothing new. This has been going on for a long time. This was our great-grandparents when they were about our age. And what ended up happening was that our great-grandpa Alf developed cancer, and the cancer was the leverage that the Brethren needed to pull them back. He was weak and vulnerable. He couldn't work for extended periods of time. And the exclusive Brethren of Wellington, which is where they were at this point, sort of poured love and support and money at their family. And probably the money is the most important thing. And there was this sort of wraparound support that the exclusive Brethren do so well. And that was the tipping point for our great-grandpa Alf to go back into the church with cancer. And this was a hugely difficult thing. So Alf had gone back into the church already, but Ruth was much harder to persuade, resolutely staying home, even when Alf started taking the children along to the services. But the pressure ratcheted up as her husband started attending meetings every Sunday and then on weeknights as well. Even so, Ruth was bewildered when he told her in the summer of 1949 that he had decided to return as a member. They'd just been on a romantic getaway to the Marlborough Sounds without the children. A blissful 2 weeks of swimming, picnicking, and napping, during which Alf had said nothing about his intentions. His wife spent the next 6 weeks in torment, describing her daily grief and despair over Alf's return to the dogmatic church of their youth. Grieved that Alf has taken a step I feel I cannot. Why? The couple spent long nights by the fire, debating exclusive brethren beliefs well past midnight as their children slept. Ruth penned a long letter to her father Fred, now in his 70s, knowing he would understand her concerns. But she showed the letter to Alf, then had a change of heart and ripped it up. 12 days later, she sat down to write a very different letter to her dad. She had finally capitulated. After 29 years of distaste for the exclusive brethren and 6 weeks of relentless pressure from her sickly husband, Ruth would also be returning to the church. She told Fred that after hours of darkness, she believed God wanted her to follow her husband. I feel now, Father, you are dearer to me than ever, but he is first. I believe the Lord has enabled me to write this letter. She had made her stand, but her emotional torment continued. Feeling yearning over Father, she wrote plaintively 4 days after declaring her position to Fred, and then, 11 days later, spent some time just tossed with doubts, a few tears. And this illustrates, I think, the turmoil that couples go through when it comes to the brethren, both for those who are inside thinking about leaving, and those on the outside who are being pressured to go back. And you really see this through our great-grandmother's diaries, this this fear, this absolute fear that she wasn't on the same page as her husband and what that might mean for their family, and that he was taking the family in a certain direction, and either she was going to go along with it or she wasn't sure what the consequences were going to be. And this heartache, really, like, I don't think there was any part of her that wanted to go back into the exclusive brethren. But I think the reading between the lines, that the fear that their family might be torn apart if she didn't go with her husband, meant that she felt she didn't have a choice. And that's a cruel, cruel position for people to be in. And I think there'll be so many brethren couples that'll be able to relate to this. Not knowing whether you're on the same page as your husband or wife, and the consequences of even admitting that you feel differently.
Yeah, that's so true, Craig. And I remember it reminds me of our grandmother Anna, who, feature later on, but she was in a similar position where she didn't believe in the brethren, and yet she had, taken marriage vows to her husband, and she also had a deeply religious belief that, you shouldn't break the marriage covenant. And that she felt that if she left, she would be breaking the marriage covenant, although it could be argued the other way, that if he didn't, go with her, he was breaking it. But we know that from their perspective, it's the fault lies with the person who chooses to leave. But yeah, our grandmother, was also torn between all these things. And then you throw into that this person is on death's door with a cancer, a huge health battle and facing impending death. And they've got 3 young children. And, you're not going to leave or turn against your sickly, dying husband's wishes as well, are you? So it sounds like she has much made that decision to keep the family together as out of anything. It wasn't necessarily about conviction about the brethren.
And again, making the point here that this was 1949. This was well before separation came in.
In terms of the eating matter and all that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. Just to finish off how the cancer ended, because I think this paints a picture of sort of where brethren thinking was at that time. So Alf went to hospital again in 1951. At that point, the doctors said, basically, you're going to die. We can't treat you any further. And sent him home to make peace with his family. Yes, in the spring of 1951, Alf visited Wellington Hospital. The assessment following his weekend stay was bleak. His treatment could go no further, and it was time for him to return home, take peace, and prepare to die. 5 doctors all agreed, Elf wrote. He was furious, resolving that faith alone was the key to winning his years-long battle with cancer. I believe God, I will do so in the face of 500 doctors if need be. Ruth, too, spurred on by her renewed all-or-nothing faith, was convinced the answer lay with God and decided after prayer to put Elf on a complete liquid diet of fruit and vegetable juices. And we're starting to see here by this point they're well back into the exclusive brethren. They're really they've gone in boots and all. This fast was to last for 40 days, a scriptural period. For more than 2 weeks, Elf had nothing but juice. Local exclusive brethren brought around boxes of produce which Ruth juiced. Elf was allowed 1 cup of tea each day at 3 p.m. as a special concession. But after 10 days, even the tea disappeared. He noted that he was going weak at the knees and rapidly losing weight. Elf's religious fervour neared delirium, and he refused to accept that death was approaching. On the 14th day of the fast, he went a step further and decided the palliative medicines he'd been prescribed at the hospital were hindering his faith. Giving up all medications would show faith in God's ability to command a healing miracle. The doctors, having given me up, I've given up their remedies too. The sleeping tabs and painkillers are down the drain. Racked with cancer, starved for a fortnight, and now feeling every shooting pain, Elf's ruined body fought on for a few more days. Pain is purifying, he wrote in his diary. 3 days after giving up his medication, he dragged himself from bed to shuffle up and down the back lawn with 5-year-old Aira, inhaling, walking 20 steps, then exhaling, every breath a painful exertion. I could feel the pulsing, tingling life in almost every nerve, he wrote, and virtue seemed to flow in from her warm hand into my gaunt, emaciated frame. Later that evening, Elf noted triumphantly that he was beating his cancer. The tide has turned. His diary ends there. The following day has a short message in Ruth's handwriting. Elf very ill indeed. He died 5 days later. And this, they genuinely believed, and it's very clear from their diaries, they genuinely believed that their brethren faith was going to save Elf's life. Didn't matter that the doctors at the hospital had said he was going to die. It didn't matter that he was supposed to be taking all this medication. They basically bugger the doctors, and not only are we going to ignore what the doctors are saying, but we're going to take him off all of the meds he's supposed to be on to make his death easier, less pain, like the ability to sleep, the ability to exist. And not only that, but we're going to starve him because fasting is scriptural. And this terrible, terrible death that he had, starved, unable to sleep, racked with pain, and still right up until the last until he lost his ability to write, he was convinced that God, as part of their brethren beliefs, was going to heal him. And again, I think the impact that had on Ruth, his wife, when he died, and you see people go through these crises of belief with the brethren, where they go all in with their brethren belief, and then something massive happens that challenges their faith and their brethren. And at that point, you're at a crossroads, I think. You either acknowledge that it's bullshit, or you go even deeper.
Yeah.
And definitely what happened for our great-grandmother was she went even deeper.
And I think,
and she,
psychologically, I'm not a psychologist and all that sort of thing, but you can see the deep layers of complexity that are going on psychologically here. Like, I certainly don't support at all what they've done here with their belief in faith for healing, and they've called it faith. They've said that that's why they did it. But I sometimes wonder if extreme acts of faith like that are actually a person in complete and utter denial, someone who's deep in psychological denial, and understandably, like, he was only in his 30s, wasn't he, and they've got 3 young children. Like, you can understand that for Alf and for Ruth, that they were absolutely desperate, and their wider family doesn't feature much here, but I'm wondering, what their other family members who weren't part of the exclusive brethren were saying to them, or challenging them about it, because they must have been incredibly worried about them, and not everybody would have supported them doing this fasting and that kind of thing. They're people who are clearly, they come across here like people who are in absolute desperation, and fair enough too, to be losing your life at a young age, leaving behind 3 young children. And I wonder if sometimes, I agree with what you've said, that people then, and after a crisis, can, we do respond in different ways. And I agree with you that sometimes people then sort of almost turn deeper to a certain path, and oftentimes it's actually not necessarily, in my view, because they believe in that path. It's again comes back to kind of a psychological denial, or an inability to it's just like the internal world collapses, which it's what it apparently happened for Ruth. Her faith was shattered after that as well as her whole world, and being left there trying to figure out how to be a solo parent to young children. Of course, in many ways, just at a purely pragmatic level, she would have stayed with the brethren, because they would have been offering that material help of with just finances and surviving and meals and with care for the children, and you do what you need to do to survive, and if that means psychologically capitulating, then you psychologically capitulate.
And it's the sunk cost fallacy as well, isn't it? Like, at this point, you've sacrificed so much into this belief structure that to admit that it's been wrong, and to admit that you've made these sacrifices for nothing is too much. So you keep going.
But it comes back to having the foundation that the exclusive brethren are built on. We come back to that. They've lost their sense of reality, right? And we see that today with them believing that they're above the law, right? They're so naive in what they do, and believing, like, their sense of reality just leaves the whole situation.
I think what really warps everything for the brethren is, like, their one unshakable belief is that the man of God can do no wrong. Like, that's the one single belief that you can't challenge, you can't question. And then when you work backwards from there, like, if that must be the case, then that means that these things must be true, and these things must be true. And by the time you get out to these sort of quite ordinary things about how you should live your life, like, because the one central, unshakable part of your belief structure is actually bullshit. You get out to the edges, and it's twisted sort of beyond recognition. You're like, well, how did we end up here? And it's like, because you believe that Bruce Hales can do no wrong. For people who are in the brethren now, when he's as fallible as the rest of us. And just skipping through, so this had an impact on Ruth's children. She was a solo mother of 3. The eldest was Lindy's grandmother, Anna, and the second was my grandfather, George. And just this chapter 4 ends talking about my grandpa and grandma meeting each other. This was in Christchurch in the early 60s. So skipping through another generation, and there's a section here. This was describing how rigorously their wedding plans were controlled. This level of control was fairly typical among exclusive brethren in 1961. Members were encouraged to confess their misdeeds at meetings that sometimes stretched until almost midnight. Lottie, a self-righteous teenager, dutifully tattled on the Christchurch brethren in conversations with George, describing how her peers were absolutely broken after being punished for sins, including fornication and dressing like the world. But Lottie herself, now 19, wasn't immune to temptation. As her wedding day approached, her interactions with George became increasingly amorous. During one of his visits, the young couple went too far one evening after Lottie's family had gone to bed. Nothing serious happened, just a bit of fumbling, really. But in the cold light of day, it felt like the end of the world to my 19-year-old grandparents. Overcome with guilt, George confessed to his mother, Ruth. She shared the news with a Brethren elder in Wellington, who promptly wrote to one of his counterparts in Christchurch. Lottie also confessed to her parents. They told the local elders, who arrived on a Wednesday evening to grill her. She told the elders how the young couple had laid down together and she had let her young fiancé put his hands down her neck, but promised them that through God's mercy it hadn't gone any further. George was sick with worry about how matters would play out, losing his appetite as he waited for news from Christchurch. No breakfast again this morning, he wrote in his diary. The elders unexpectedly decided the young couple's misdeeds weren't bad enough to warrant public attention. They told Lottie the matter could be closed in private so long as her and George's stories tallied and they'd told the full truth. 60 years later, I wonder how Grandpa George would feel about me reading these personal letters. His horror and shame seem a world away, yet strangely it feels as though his letters, carefully saved for many years, have brought us closer together. Being spared public shame was a huge relief for George and Lottie, inspiring the 19-year-olds to recommit to their faith. It was, Lottie told George, a reminder that their marriage would be sacred before God. The main thing is that I'll always have you with me and me with you. And that section for me was quite a shock when I came across this in my grandparents' letters. Because of course we've all been through those sexual grillings from the priests where we're asked about who did what and who put their hands where, and you feel it's the worst thing in the world, and surely you're the first person who has been bad enough to warrant this kind of grilling from the elders. And it was just like a real shock to me to read about my grandparents having the exact same experience 2 generations earlier, and I was like, nothing has changed.
It's really weird, isn't it, Craig? That's just such a good point. Yeah, it really is the same old cycles continuing, handed on from generation to generation. Yeah, really fascinating, in a horrifying kind of a way. Yeah.
Right? It just blows your mind sitting here just feeling this all right of how cyclical this has been for 200 years. It's really sad.
It just never stops.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, it is fascinating seeing how these things are so similar to things that exclusive brethren people could have written in their own diaries today, right? Wow. And for people who are listening, not viewing, there are photographs as well that we'll be sharing that you will have seen and will keep seeing as well. So if you want to check those out, you can, of these people. But so then the book shifts gear, right, Craig, and you move into chapter 5. You fast forward back to your own story and your own experiences. And it begins, the line says, my childhood feelings of being a round peg in a square hole intensified as I grew older. Yeah.
Yes, and just this was around the time when I was realizing that I was gay and what that meant, being in the Brethren, nothing good. And skipping through to when I was a little bit older, around 18, this was the first time that I had had sex with anyone, my first sexual encounter, and coming off the back of what we've just heard of George and Francie's experience, remarkably similar feelings. So I'll just pick up my story here. I met Paul through the personal listings in the Southland Times. More than a year after calling the gay sex hotline, which had also not gone well, I'd plucked up the courage to go a step further. My crushing fear of being excommunicated was eclipsed by exploding hormones, and I was desperate for connection. Physical connection, yes, but also emotional connection with someone who understood how I felt. I made an excuse for why I needed to go out that evening. It was the autumn of 2007, a few days short of my 18th birthday. Dialed the number from a payphone on Tay Street. I'd learnt my lesson. To my surprise, Paul agreed to meet and invited me over to his home. Fortunately, it wasn't near where any brethren lived. Members operated like a spy network, and I knew it would be reported back to my parents or the priests if my car was seen parked on an unexpected street. The first thing I noticed about Paul was his shoulder-length blonde hair. Brethren men weren't allowed to grow their hair long, so this marked him out as a worldly. Welcoming and friendly, he ushered me through to a dimly lit room where a purple mosquito net hung bunched up over a neatly made bed. I could barely speak. Part of me was terrified, knowing I was about to cross a point of no return. I also thrilled with anticipation at being so close to another man as we undressed. What did he think of my body? Would he take the lead and show me what to do? How was I supposed to know where to put my hands and whether he was okay with it? Our encounter was awkward, over almost before it began. I was too embarrassed to tell Paul it was my first time. Guilt swept through me. I slunk furtively back to my Toyota Corona, hidden up a side street across the road from Donovan Park, and my stomach churned as I scanned for any brethren observers. Had I been followed? Would my sin be discovered? I didn't know what I'd been thinking. All my life I'd heard terrible stories about warnings about people being cast from the flock. Now I was sure my turn had come. After I snuck home through the back door, I couldn't sleep. Convinced my life was over, I shut myself in the study and with shaking hands called Daniel Hales in Sydney. The Hales family was still the pinnacle of Brethren fellowship. Daniel's father, John Hales, had died a few years earlier, and Daniel's younger brother was Bruce, the new man of God. Daniel knew I was the great-grandson of Johnny Wright, who had rebuked John Hales for speeding all of those years ago. I knew that if I could plead my case to anyone, it would be directly to the Hales family. Daniel, a grey-haired, cardigan-wearing businessman, listened as I told him in a trembling voice that I had something terrible to confess. I could still feel Paul's body pressed against mine, my hands running through his long blonde hair, and I tried desperately to push his face out of my mind. In a state of shock, I couldn't bring myself to tell Daniel what I'd actually done. But to my surprise, he was kind, fatherly almost, and calmed me down. Whatever you've done, he said, there is a way through, and it surely won't be as bad as you fear. He told me to take my confession to Peter Hickmott, one of the Invercargill elders, and be honest with him about what had happened. Tell him not to do anything without talking to me first. The next morning, I was shaking as Peter closed the door to his study. I'd barely noticed the autumn clouds or the well-pruned rose bushes lining the path outside. Peter was an awkward man. He and his wife didn't have children, and his owlish spectacles and halting nature belied the power he was accumulating within the Brethren system. The man of God himself had stayed in this house, and I knew that anything I told Peter would be repeated directly to the Hales brothers in Sydney. Peter questioned me closely as I revealed my misdeeds, just as Grandpa George had revealed his 50 years earlier. Who touched what? What went where? How many times? I felt unclean. I wished the floor would open and swallow me. Soldiering on, I gave every last detail I could think of, with one crucial exception. I denied I was gay. I pretended that I'd been experimenting in a foolish, youthful misstep that had no deeper meaning. Peter must have had his doubts, but he kept them to himself. After our meeting, I waited on tenterhooks, pacing my room, unable to engage in conversation, as Peter conferred with Daniel. I was bracing for the axe to fall, knowing I could face public humiliation and excommunication. When the edict finally came back, I was astonished. Like George and Lottie all those years ago, I was told my confession showed God's Spirit was working in me, and the matter of my misdeeds could be closed in private. Which really did feel like a narrow escape at the time. But that experience of going through these priestlies where you have all of these details dragged out of you and made to feel like you are the one who's at fault, when really the whole process is completely inappropriate. And then when they do show you grace or compassion, as they would describe it, you're thrown back on their mercy, and it sort of works to reinforce the system that you're a part of. When you take a step back and look at it, it's wildly inappropriate for teenagers to be raked over the coals like this about their sexual activity. It's not professional, and it's not safe.
Yeah. My gosh, there's so much going on here. And I think, one of the first thoughts that I had was, in this chapter. This chapter's, explicit in a way. Heck, you write about masturbation, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
Brethren don't say the M word out loud, let alone write it in a book. And so, this chapter, it names stuff, it puts stuff on the table, it puts having sex on the table, it puts calling hotlines on the table. And I guess I just want to say at the outset that all of these things that are supposedly so taboo and nobody does them are incredibly common across the brethren, and that there's, everybody in the brethren, hello, despite your headscarf and your lovely white shirt or whatever, you have a sexuality, and everybody at some point has, mentally, physically engaged with their sexuality and engaged with experimentation or thinking either with just themselves or with others. We also know from hearing accounts as well as maybe our own experiences that, again, many of these lovely people sitting in their rows and the brethren have experimented with sexual encounters with people on the outside. And increasingly, now that they have got technology and the internet available to them, that the use of pornography and online sex and chat rooms and all that kind of thing to connect sexually with people has absolutely exploded across the board among the brethren. So I kind of want to name it at the outset to go, you know what, this freaking isn't taboo, or it shouldn't be taboo, because it's so common that, I would go so far as to say that probably every single person in the brethren, whether they're now a grey-haired 80-year-old or they're a pimply-faced 16-year-old, has probably had illicit sexual encounters. And so I actually love that you, as awkward as it might feel from my brethren perspective to discuss this stuff openly, it's like, yes, this needs to be discussed openly. It needs to be tabled. And we need to talk about the brethren response, which is so black and white in categories of morality, and that, you as a young person struggling with your sexual identity and orientation, what you needed was understanding, somebody to listen to you, to somebody to explain to you what being gay was, that you're not a freak, that this is a known phenomena. And yes, there's a broad spectrum within that of gay experience and expression, but to instead you responded just solely with the category of, this is sin, this is evil, this is darkness. That was the only category you were given to interpret your experiences through. And I think it's the same for masturbation. It's the same for so many of these things. It's like, bang, this, even sexual abuse, right? It wasn't, as you know, Cheryl, so many times it wasn't responded to in the sense of, what is going on here, even for a perpetrator or an abuser, what's going on here? Let's talk about this. It is instead responded to by priests in the category of sin and shame and moral failure, right? It's wrong.
It was such a failure because you had no concept of how widespread it was or what everyone else was up to, because nobody was admitting it. And I was talking to a leader recently, and they were saying, like, they were convinced that they had a sex addiction problem, because one of the rules was that you had to be pure for at least 6 months before you got married, which meant like no masturbating for 6 months before your wedding day. And they had realized, or they had resigned themselves, that they would never ever be able to go 6 months without masturbating. Therefore, they would never be able to get married. And they'd held this belief that there must be something wrong with them for such a long time, because that was what the reason taught. And we were talking about it, and there's just this dawning look as they're like, I only just realized that everybody was masturbating in there and lying about it.
And no priest should even know. You shouldn't, to any
exactly.
that's listening to this right now, that is nobody's business. No priest that shouldn't come out of anybody's mouth. And you shouldn't have to report that to anybody. That is your own personal that's your own personal experience with your own intimacy with yourself. Like that is not up to anybody else to have that kind of information.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you want to talk about, if you want to talk about your sexual expression or identity or experimentation or whatever, then seek out professional help. There are trusted professionals, and again, be careful of that, because there are people who market themselves out there as being someone to talk to about these things, and they might not be safe. So, but you can find like qualified, trained sexual health therapists and professionals who can give you a balanced view. And you can find Christian ones if you want to find there are other Christian worldviews on this kind of topic than just this very black and white category of it is only sin and only shameful.
Yes, exactly.
Talk to a professional, not a priest.
Yeah, that should be on a shirt. Find the Olive Leaf Network.
Exactly. So we'll just skip through to the end of that chapter, because I'd been cast on I'd become part of the Brethren system of confessions and priestlies, and where you confess, this idea that you have to confess every last sin because that's what gets you in the clear. And so this just went on and on and on. And this is how the chapter ends. Away from the preaching and backslapping, doubts crept through my mind like shadows at dusk, swirling together with curiosity in an intoxicating dance. But when I started asking questions, I was quickly shut down. That was perplexing to me. The Bible recounted how Jesus, aged 12, had sat questioning his elders in the temple. If that was good enough for Jesus, I reasoned, surely questions were okay. During group conversations after church meetings, I openly challenged some of our teachings while my fellow brethren awkwardly shuffled their feet. Why can't we be left to make our own judgments about what TV shows are okay? Why is it okay for brethren to campaign for political parties, but not okay for us to vote? Questions like these were a direct challenge to the divinely appointed man of God. It was deeply isolating to have doubts when everyone in my community was supposed to be moving in lockstep. There was no diversity of thought, and disagreement was tantamount to treason. I didn't know how to find others who shared my doubts. Most were too afraid to speak out, and if I had revealed my true feelings to someone, there was a chance they would have reported me to the priests. A careless word could have got me excommunicated. For most brethren, the only path was to just keep quiet, but as the church tried to control my understanding of the world, I was already grasping the scope of what lay beyond. Ethel Green did his best to head off my doubts when I tentatively shared them during our phone calls. He said I should stay loyal to Peter Hickmott, the Lord has given him to you, and that if I couldn't muster my own faith, I should fall into line behind brethren whose faith was stronger than mine. As we continued our conversations, I from my bedroom, he from his home in Penrith, Ethel warned that if I allowed any doubts, the devil would try to get me to discount the brethren. These chats with Ethel weren't all doom and gloom. He was still optimistic that I would find a way through and settle down as a loyal Brethren member. Keep at it, son, just keep at it. We're going to win. The key to this, Ethel said, was to unfailingly follow the teachings of his son-in-law, Bruce Hales, the man of God, a lovely man. And then, Ethel added, he's Christ. This sort of talk, while blasphemous to most Christians, was fairly common among the brethren. They were increasingly putting the man of God on the same level as Jesus himself, and Ethel had no qualms about doing so. All you need in your soul, Ethel told me, comes from these great men. Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
So much to unpack. Could be another podcast all in itself.
Yeah. This whole, looking back, it's astonishing that Ethel Green, may he rest in peace, would describe his own son-in-law like just, he's Christ. And this is, like, for anyone who's listening, this is not me remembering a conversation that happened. Like as I was talking to Ethel Green, I was writing down everything he was saying verbatim, and I believed it at the time. And so this is taken directly from the notes of our conversations at the time. So this is not just me misremembering it with a particular sort of anti-brethren lens. This is what was said as I wrote down as a brethren member, believing everything that was being said. Um, and it's terrifying to have doubts in the brethren when this is what you're
Yeah.
being told.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes. Yeah. Like I mean, on page 107, yeah, I want to say as well to the listeners that don't consider just because you've listened to this podcast that you don't need to read the book, because Craig is missing out so much,
Yeah,
and
there's
there's
a
so
lot.
many paragraphs. Yeah, there's so many paragraphs and little anecdotes that it just really describes so much more. Like, this really is a whistle stop tour. And so do read the book when you get a chance. But yeah, page 107, you talk about doubts a wee bit more, and you said doubts were considered a sin by the brethren. Popular refrains from the church leaders included statements like, we'll do the thinking, you do the doing. And if you don't understand it, just don't question it. And, we kind of laugh when we hear those because we remember them. I remember those quotes. And, they're thought-stopping cliches is a term used, I think, to describe them in the kind of field of the culty sphere. But you're right, doubts themselves were actually considered a sin as well, and taboo. You were not allowed to express doubts, even in the form of a question. And so when you've got someone who's close to Bruce Hales as well, and that gives him added authority, saying, he's Christ, it really would have been taken by this young you as absolute fact that he is Christ. And while you knew it didn't necessarily maybe mean that he was actually Jesus Christ, you knew the point of what he was saying, which is that he is Christ to us, that he is, the manifestation of God that we have in front of us, and that, his word is divine and all that kind of thing. And all of it is reinforcing this thing that if you go against what this Christ says, you will go to outer darkness and ruin. Like, it's just building up this incredible polarization, right? Of like this wrestle within you and this wrestle without of choices, and which choice do I take? And being reinforced that if you choose being gay or to leave the brethren and to leave Christ, that you'll only go to darkness. And yet you're wrestling with this inattention, going, I don't think that's right. I don't think I can agree with it.
mm, mm. And it feels like you're being torn apart.
Yeah.
And it's that feeling that when you know that something's a bit bullshit, but you don't dare let yourself admit it.
Yeah.
And I think that's still the experience that a lot of people in the Brethren are having, where they think that the louder you shout it, the easier it will be to make yourself believe it. And that's just not the case. Like, saying this, shouting it from the rooftops is not going to make it any more true.
Yeah, and it's really, I appreciate that line in there that you read out, that everyone in the community was supposed to be moving in lockstep, because that is so true. And yeah, it's an interesting term, lockstep. Like, it brings to mind that kind of military soldier, like everyone dress the same, move the same, think the same. And that is what it was like to be part of the Brethren. And it is still like that today to a large extent. Even I'm fascinated that they've moved to having their schools to be global. And again, it's very similar that, internationally, the rooms have all got to look the same. They've all got the same posters. They've all got the same furniture. Like, they've got the same uniforms. It's right from a young age that unbelievable uniformity is being conditioned into these people. And it is terrifying to step out of that lockstep.
And to all the insiders in there, doubts are healthy. Doubts are normal. Doubts are often our intuition and our gut and our own spirit speaking to ourselves that's saying, hey, something isn't right here. So write your doubts down. Maybe that's something that you guys can do, is write them down And like, don't just hand your doubts over to a priest. Like that's that is going to squash them. Do your own research. Find ways to research the doubts that you're having.
Yeah, I
Right.
kept my
Write a
doubts in a
letter
little
like Lindy did.
Yeah, I kept, before I wrote the letter to Bruce Hales, I kept my notes, my doubts. I was writing them down in a notebook, and I bought a locked briefcase, and I kept them in that because, again, this is the days before phones and stuff, so I couldn't take notes on my phone. But I actually had to have a locked briefcase because I knew you weren't allowed to write and explore your doubts. And I wasn't writing anything bad or anything condemning the brethren. It was literally just my questions, and some of them were so inane. It was like, why can't men wear shorts? Why can't I, take a meal to my neighbor who's sick? Yeah, and some of them were a bit more, intense, like why is people of a different race not allowed to marry each other in the brethren, and why can't I go to university? But yeah, my initial thought was I just want the answers for these. If the brethren are right and they're God's only position, there will be answers and I'll find them. So I encourage you, dear brethren, go and read the ministry. Go and do that, because that's what I did. I dug into the ministry. I didn't have internet. I dug into the ministry and I dug into the Bible, looking for answers to my doubts and my questions. And I encourage you to do the same. Go on.
Love it.
See where it leads.
And if you don't want to write it down and you don't have a locked briefcase, make yourself an anonymous email account and just keep all your stuff in your own email account. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that leads us on neatly to the next chapter. And we'll just skip through a bit here, but it talks about the introduction of separation and what that did to families at the time. And so our great grandmother Ruth cut off all of her family outside of the brethren, and a cruel experience for so many people. But through all this, Anna and George, so that's Lindy's nana and my grandpa, were raising young families. And so we pick up in the 1970s here, going back to the doubts thing. As Ruth grappled with the consequences of rejecting her family, her children, Anna and George, were too busy raising their own to spare much time thinking about doctrine. For George, it was easier just to go with the flow. Distracted by 3 children, he didn't pay much attention as rules were introduced, slowly and gradually. However, by the 1970s, the siblings were having nagging doubts about whether the exclusive brethren were everything they claimed to be. Members were routinely excommunicated for minor infractions like wearing shorts or listening to the radio, and Anna agonized over the love and compassion that seemed to be missing from the increasingly hardline church. Part of her regretted not following Gerald Cowell when he had objected to Big Jim's separation doctrine, which she thought went far beyond what Scripture could justify. In a bizarre twist, when Anna fell under church discipline in 1977, it had nothing to do with her doubts. The elders in Auckland discovered she and Rob had taken their children to sex education evenings 5 years earlier. Anna hadn't had any sex talks from Ruth and didn't want her own children growing up ignorant. On the evening their eldest daughter, Kathleen, got engaged, priests turned up at the family's doorstep. They questioned Rob about those innocent classes and claimed he was evasive in his answers. That was enough for them to justify shutting him and Anna up so the matter could be investigated further. What was supposed to be a night of celebration turned to horror as the 6 eldest children were ordered to pack suitcases and then bundled out the door to stay with other brethren families in Auckland, their parents feeling they had no choice but to comply. It was the last Anna saw of her children for 8 months. Like my grandma Edith, Anna sat heartbroken at home under assembly discipline while her eldest daughter's marriage was approved by brethren elders. Kathleen had only just turned 18, and her grandmother Ruth, now living in Wellington, travelled to Auckland to be there for the wedding day in the absence of Kathleen's mother. Kathleen was the first of Ruth's grandchildren to marry, but how could Ruth fully enjoy the occasion, knowing her daughter Anna, missed terribly by Kathleen, was under assembly discipline? Ruth noted in her diary that it had been a very, very happy occasion, yet a shadow in the background that Robert and Anna were not available. Anna, a busy mother of 7, had gone from a frenetic home and church routine to ghostly silence overnight. She was kept sane only by her youngest daughter, who at 2.5 was deemed too young to be removed to brethren custody. Being separated from her children was a lesson for Anna in what the church's punishment could look like. After that, she tried to do a better of conforming to the rules. My grandpa George and his brother mostly supported the Brethren practice of shunning rule breakers until it happened to him. As Brethren misdemeanors went, it was minor. His wife, Lottie, had taken their 3 kids to swim at a nearby beach after school on a hot summer afternoon. Where she went wrong was also taking children from another Brethren family, as this was a breach of a recent ban on mixed bathing, which dictated that males and females should not swim together if they weren't from the same family. The local priest confronted George about it. Why did you allow mixed bathing to go on in your household? And he covered for Lottie to avoid throwing her under the bus. He hadn't even known about the beach trip, so it wasn't a question of whether he had allowed it to happen, but he accepted the principle that a man should be responsible for his house and took his punishment on the chin. George and Lottie were shut up at home for several weeks, while the priest grilled them about the mixed bathing incident. To George's surprise, there was no deep spiritual searching or sympathetic comfort from the priests during their confinement. Instead, it was all procedural based on how to keep to the rules. He had always assumed that being shut up before coming back to the meetings would lead to renewed faith and was an opportunity for spiritual cleansing. The priests he had previously believed needed to wait for some kind of breakthrough to show that he and Lottie were sorry and could be forgiven. But to his surprise, no such moment arrived. After a few weeks, the priests decided the couples had sufficiently faced their sins. The men duly reported that George and Lottie could be restored to happy fellowship, but George didn't feel any different to how he had been before the experience. After that, he paid closer attention as his peers were shut up and withdrawn from. There was nothing spiritual or godly or encouraging about it, he soon realized. He came to see it as a crushing process. In his eyes, these people had been hammered down until they agreed not to make waves anymore. Picking at the thread didn't end there. The doubts kept coming. As the 1970s rolled into the 1980s, one question about the Brethren kept rolling around in his head. He wondered if somewhere along the line they had stopped being the one true church.
Oof, yeah.
So powerful.
And so much more. There's so much more in that chapter as well, hey, that you haven't read out and haven't discussed now. But wow, yeah. And it's fascinating that thing of, George kind of being busy with his family and going along with it all. And then his experience of, what did you say? It wasn't until it happened to him.
Yeah.
Someone said something about, him not realizing what the Priestleys were like and what the process of church discipline was like, and how actually unscriptural and unspiritual it was, and how brutally unfair it was until it happened to him. Because I now think that for my father Steve, and he's been interviewed by Cheryl on this podcast as well, but I think that the process was probably similar for him in some ways. That I think sometimes it's not until you really feel the underbelly of it all yourself, you really feel the harsh side, it's easy to kind of keep living in denial and just, well, I guess you're just trusting that the priests are doing a good job, and you believe their line. They trot out at the meeting and say, oh, so-and-so wasn't walking with 2 Timothy 2, and you just trust them, and that person never gets the chance to share their side of the story, so you don't know. Whereas, George went through this experience just like all these years later, his nephew, my dad, experienced of actually, this is, what did you say? There was nothing spiritual or godly or encouraging about it. He came to see it as a crushing process. These people had been hammered down until they agreed not to make waves anymore. Wow. So many of us who have experienced church discipline from the Brethren would describe that was the process that we have endured.
And this is this has been going on for such a long time. Like, this is our grandparents' generation describing this, but it could be how any of us described it now. Like,
this is 50 years ago.
And for as much as, the line you keep hearing from people who are still, oh, we've changed. Things are different now. Like, we don't operate like that anymore. And the lie to that really is that people keep leaving, and they keep describing the experiences they are having right now. And I am in contact, as Lindy and Cheryl no doubt are, with so many people who are still in the Brethren or who are in the process of leaving. And the way they are describing those experiences is exactly as my grandpa George is describing it here from 50 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. And it's actually quite freakish and quite bizarre, isn't it? Like I remember reading George's letter that he read out to he didn't read it. He posted it out to the Wellington Assembly. He was planning to preach it on a Tuesday night or something, wasn't he? But then he got excommunicated and couldn't. So he put it into a letter form and posted it to Wellington Assembly. And yeah, and again, I can't remember what year that was, and you might cover it in the book, but I remember reading that like 50 years later and being like, oh my gosh, like there's so much in here of what I also have just written to Bruce Hales. Like it was like, what? This is bonkers. It's like all these years apart, and it's the same character, the same spirit of things, as you've said.
And it's different rules. Like it's whether you can listen to the radio or whether you can use a fax machine, and now it's whether you can have a phone without streamline, or whether, like, in a way that the rules that are being argued about don't really matter. Like the underlying passion here is the control that sits behind it.
Pig is still a pig, whether it's got lipstick on or whatever. Exactly. I don't know what
it's like my parents, like when Bruce Hales took over, right? It was the same thing that was brought to me. Everything's changed in here. Everything's changed. And all you can see is that Bruce Hales just took them into this candy shop, right? Everything was changed, but it's still locked on the outside, right? To the point where the police were interrogating somebody the other day, and it was said, they were like, it was a family that was treated badly, and they're like, oh no, like we've been apologized to, it's all been forgiven, we're not like that anymore. And no, like, to those people that are those just simple grassroots brethren that are watching this just to see what we're up to, it is still like that. It 110% is still like this. Nothing has changed because the color of your house that Bruce has you inside is painted differently. The lock is still on the front door. It's just the insides have changed. It's all still the same.
He's given you more toys to play with and brought in material prosperity and indulgence, because that's his own personal Achilles heel, and the thing that he really loves himself. He wants a lovely, comfortable golden cage with lots of toys, and he's making that available for everybody else too, because he's so generous and kind. But yeah, it's the same. Yeah.
I mean, the acid test really is, if you stand up in the middle of a meeting now and say Bruce Hales is wrong, what's going to happen to you?
Yeah.
You'd be blocked out.
Exactly the same thing that's been happening for the last 100 years, more than 100 years. And
that horrendous podcast, Cheryl, I can't remember the young man's name, or if it was actually given, but where they played the Priestley
podcast
with him.
110, podcast 110.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely horrendous. And that Priestley was not from that long ago, was it? And the language there used again of like, do you want to go into hell, into outer darkness and ruin, or do you want to, be here with our beloved brother Bruce Hales? All that. It's like, that's at the core of it.
Exactly. And I'm sure there was many people that related to that podcast. I know all the young ones in Maple Creek that got priestly visits in Maple Creek. That's what our priestly visits were like. Whether it was on my paper route, or whether it was in our living room, or whether it was out in a car in front of the house, or out in a field somewhere else, that is how we got talked to in Maple Creek. And so I think it's super important that we lay it out the way that you're laying it out, Craig, and showing that this isn't something that just popped up now, right? It's been happening for a long time. It hasn't changed. Just your building that you're sitting in has changed. Yeah.
Exactly.
Chapter 7.
Aberdeen.
Chapter 7. Aberdeen, drum roll.
I think what's before we get to the Aberdeen part of chapter 7 is just really important to just talk for a bit about the rise of alcohol in the Brethren in the 1960s, and what a massive impact that had on Brethren doctrine, and how I think the rise of alcohol in the 60s was part of what tipped the Exclusive Brethren from being sort of an ultra-conservative cult to being a cult that was also like a bit nuts.
And that also had like and huge sanctioned indulgences within their
Mm,
community. Because
mm,
before that, there was this strong thread of sort of, which again came through, I understand, from Derby. There was this austerity and an asceticism of yeah, that not indulging so much in the pleasures of the world, and yeah, whether it was alcohol or fine gardens or houses or material luxury, those things were eschewed. Like Darby did, I understand, wasn't into his fancy food and would travel around on horseback, and that kind of side of him did mark the brethren, that they weren't into all that stuff, and the wider brethren too. Not just the exclusives, but they were known for not being so into material prosperity and the pleasures of life. Whereas it was like alcohol just opened that door for that, didn't it? And as the
mm,
saying says, the fish rots from the head. Like, let's be clear, the love of alcohol in the brethren has 100% come from the leaders.
Yeah.
It's not just something
mm,
that's like a subculture among some people in the brethren. It was encouraged and endorsed and held up as a role model from Christ, from the one at the top, saying, pour me a whiskey.
mm,
And then now they've added antidepressants onto it. So I think that's the biggest thing is like, I don't know if the you guys don't know inside there, but you're not supposed to mix alcohol with antidepressants. And that's a massive problem that is happening inside there. I mean, that does so much damage to the brain.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we just read a bit of the rise of alcoholism here. Elect Vessel James Taylor Jr.'s path to alcoholism was slow at first and then swept the Exclusive Brethren with a vengeance. Big Jim was a shy man as he jostled to protect his father's legacy in the late 1950s and early 1960s. He found that having a few drinks of scotch helped him get through the meetings where he was expected to take a leading role. Until then, Brethren had been largely teetotal, drinking in moderation or not at all, and most members had no frame of reference for seeing the effects of alcohol on one another. Hard liquor was up there with cigarettes as one of the vices of the world, until the script suddenly flipped. Big Jim's few drinks spiraled as he rose to prominence. By the time he visited New Zealand to host meetings at the Whangarei Town Hall in early 1962, he was openly encouraging previously teetotal brethren to join him in taking up the bottle. The whole meeting centered around the idea that we should be free to drink, an astonishing turn of events for the gathered conservative brethren farmers and small business owners who had congregated to hear the elect vessel on a special visit from New York. Big Jim reasoned that alcohol was part of God's creation and therefore meant to be enjoyed by the saints. Nobody dared point out the obvious, but it was on people's minds. Well, so was tobacco. Whiskey
Yeah,
drinking soon be
and sex and everything else.
and cannabis for that matter. Um, Whiskey drinking soon became a test of faith. If you weren't doing it, then you were out of line with the elect vessel. Big Jim, previously shy, increasingly led riotous church meetings, while few brethren recognized that he was in the advanced stages of alcoholism. Dignified old men were made to stand up and get publicly humiliated for not drinking. Even pregnant women were forced to drink. Alcohol loosened your tongue, the logic went. So if you avoided drinking, it must mean you had something to hide. The brethren coined a number of absurd phrases to justify their alcohol consumption, and these were still regularly repeated when I was a teenager decades later. Drink and be free, and drink makes a strong man stronger and a weak man weaker. I still can't say that with a straight face. And just skipping through, this is talking about the extremist doctrine that came through. And then by 1965, Big Jim's drinking was so heavy that he had to be hospitalized due to the effects of alcohol on his liver. But by the end of the decade, he was drinking heavily again. When he visited his daughter, Concy Hales, in Sydney for Christmas 1969, they drank until they were bleary-eyed. On a trip to Canada the same year, Big Jim emerged from his bedroom the morning after his arrival and spotted the host's whiskey collection, asking, "Can I have some of that with breakfast?" The host, astonished but knowing it was unthinkable to turn down such a request from the elect vessel, told him to go ahead, and watched in further astonishment as Big Jim filled a water glass with Black Label scotch, then drank it with his bacon and eggs. Big Jim's host kept track that weekend. The elect vessel was drinking 1.5 bottles of whiskey a day. And I think that's a really good scene setter for leading up to what happened at Aberdeen. Is at this point, JT Jr. was so far down the alcoholism stage that a lot of the time, not much of what he said made sense. And there are still recordings of him, including at Aberdeen, where he's almost incoherent. And the Brethren were really tying themselves up into knots at this point in the late 1960s, because if you believe that the man of God or the elect vessel can do no wrong, or he's Christ, as Atul Green later said about BDH, you can't possibly admit to yourself that there's something wrong with this person, that this person is an alcoholic, that alcohol is impacting how this person is behaving. And so you end up in a really messed up place where everything that this person says, you're having to retrofit all of your other beliefs to make it make sense. And so I think that for the Brethren in the late 1960s, they were getting to a really difficult place where they were having to go sort of further and further down these quite extreme paths to try and apply some kind of logic to the way the elect vessel was behaving. When it was clear to any outsider that he was, off his trolley, so to speak.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Craig. That's a helpful term, that term retrofitting, because you're right, and it's what you mentioned earlier about, for the Brethren, they've made the starting point this place of saying, they've made it the cornerstone of their whole system, their whole doctrine is to say that this leader is the divinely appointed call of our day. Another expression that's used, harking back to Paul the Apostle, saying that he is this divinely appointed, infallible person, and therefore everything else that happens has to be interpreted from that perspective. And so no matter what their behavior is, whether it's alcoholism, whether it's indecency with women, whether it's potentially illegalities or unethical things with money, oh no, the leader can't be wrong. It wasn't them. It's been misinterpreted. They're a good, godly person, and it's there's some other reason to explain all of this. I mean, the recordings from him around that time are unbelievable. As you say, they, to an outsider, you're like, this guy's off his rocker. It's as clear as anything, and you can get, you record some of what he's saying on page 135, and these recordings are available, as you said, but he used vile words. He'd talk about people's breasts and bottoms, and he, here's one of some of what he said at one meeting: "You bum, you big bum, Scott, bum, Scott, bum, Scott. Now you have it. You've never had it so good, you stinking bum." Like, what on earth? Like, in what planet is this somebody who's the manifestation of the Spirit of God? Someone who talks like this, like, it actually just defies belief.
Again, we're so far removed from reality. Like, that's what happens when you place somebody in the position like they place their man of God in. We have this issue. Reality is just dissolved. And I will put a little bit of a clip of that, what Lindy just read out, and I'll attach the full link to that recording that Craig and Lindy are referring to below in the description.
David, where have you been? Thank God for you. Thank God for you every time. You've been stinking somewhere. Where you been doing that? In hell. You haven't had any privilege to do that. You feeling better? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. Are you feeling better, David? Thank God for that. You feeling better, David? Thank God for that. The whole thing. Where were the intestines? Were that trouble? The hell with them. Hell with them. Hell with them. You hear that, George? George! George! Did you hear? Yes. Hell with the other one. Hell with the other one. David's all right. And we're going to keep him all right. So these demons. Stay away, good dude. What do you think we're going to get on with all these songs from Detroit? To hell with them. Hell with them, I said. Hell with them. You big bum, you. You never had it so good. And don't you think you're going to go away with this stuff. You here. What's your name? Son of a bitch. John Gaskin. Get up. You look like nothing. Sit down. You never had it like this before. Eric, wait. You wait, Eric. Well, get up and perform. Eric, get up. Get up, Eric. Get up. Eric, get up. Get up. You never had it like this before. Hey, you stupid people here, what do you think I am? I'm a professor. Yeah, you. I'm not finished with you yet. You not get up. I'm not finished with you yet. Well, I'll tell you this. Don't you mention the cars anymore, numbers, or what the hell I am. You never had it like this before. No? That son of a bitch. I be careful using the word son of a bitch because I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know. You have to be careful about it. Is everything all right with your bowels? You never had it so good. Oh, no. Sit down. I would like you to introduce you to Nicodemus. And will you answer the question that I will ask you, Nicodemus? You couldn't. Who are you? Who are you? Get the hell out of here. Hell, I said. Hell out of here. You big bum there, you Bennett. What are you doing there? You never had it like this before. Now, we have some other things before us, what I want to be being before you. What I want to be. There are things that I would like to bring before you.
I just think it's really important to make the point here as well that the brethren who were in Aberdeen for these meetings believed in JC Jr. Like they had already gone through separation, they had already gone through losing all their fishing boats in Scotland, that there had already been sort of these massive tests of faith in JC Jr. that had brought them to this point. And so nobody was arriving in Aberdeen thinking, hey, let's take down the elect vessel. Nobody was thinking, hey, we're going to go there and challenge him on what he says. Like everybody who was there at Aberdeen was there believing that JC Jr. was the elect vessel, believing that he was God's divine representative, believing that everything he said came straight from heaven. And so they were trying to make it make sense. And like I think what Aberdeen shows is that you can retrofit, but you can, like everybody has a tipping point. You can only retrofit so far before you're forced to admit that something's not right.
Yeah.
And for the people who...
Or to chop off large parts of your brain to make sure that you can fit.
Yeah.
And this was the point. And I think the other thing, the people who were at these meetings in Aberdeen, and what Lindy was just reading out there, took place during the Saturday meetings at Aberdeen. Nobody challenged JT Jr. on what he was saying. Everybody was going along with it. Everybody was, if not explicitly agreeing with it, everybody was happy to be there. Like there was cheering in the room. People were going along with it. Like Aberdeen wasn't a hostile environment for JT Jr. And it really only unraveled after it became clear what had happened outside of the meetings. And if you think sort of this kind of talk in the meetings is outrageous, then this was really the only tip of the iceberg for what had happened in Aberdeen. And it came to a head. So this happened at the Saturday meetings. Then these 500 brethren showed up for the Sunday meeting at the main hall in Aberdeen, and JT Jr. was nowhere to be seen. And you can imagine what that would be like now if BDH just disappeared in the middle of 3-day meetings. It would cause a stir. Everybody would want to know what was going on. And so you've got these 500 brethren gathered at the meeting room in Aberdeen trying to work out what the heck has happened to JT Jr. And so we'll pick up back here explaining what had happened. Gradually, the story emerged. The elect vessel had been involved in a major bust-up the night before and had been sent packing. Big Jim had taken a liking to 35-year-old Madeline Kerr, a brethren woman just half his age, with a demure smile and shoulder-length dark brown hair. Madeline and her husband, Alan, had been invited to attend the special meetings in Aberdeen. They were originally billeted to stay with brethren in nearby Lawrence Kirk, but their plans were rearranged at Big Jim's insistence so they could stay with him at the home of an Aberdeen leader, James Alex Gardner, a rising star among the British brethren. That Thursday night, brethren gathered in the Gardner home were baffled as they watched Alan Kerr lead his barefooted wife, clad in a dressing gown, through to the elect vessel's bedroom. Alan then returned to his own bedroom alone, and his wife wasn't seen leaving Big Jim's room until 6 the next morning. That Friday evening, she was again led by her husband to the elect vessel's bedroom around 11 p.m, and again Alan returned to his own room alone. When Big Jim wasn't in his bedroom with Madeline, he was holding court with whiskey and women in the living room of the trim blue and white bungalow. A steady supply of hard liquor was passed around. As he became increasingly intoxicated on the Friday evening, he demanded that the women in the room sit on his lap one by one. A queue of them, some quite young, some married, some single, formed beside his chair, and husbands were forced to watch as the elect vessel fondled their wives' breasts, legs, and bottoms. Several of the women wept as they awaited their turn, but Big Jim just joked about how their underwear prevented easy access. Their host,
What a
Gardner,
bastard! What a bastard! I'm sorry, I just
is-
have to interrupt. It's this despicable abuse of power. I just, yeah, probably as a woman as well, just like putting myself in those shoes, that is a huge sexual violation, a violation of every part of those women and of their husbands, and it's just despicable.
And can you think of what those women were feeling like down there? Or what they were feeling like? They know their husbands can't stick up for them. They know they have to endure that. They know it's not right. And you literally have to sit there and allow it to happen.
Exactly. And so carrying on, because it gets worse, their host, Gardner, was shocked by what was happening. As music started up again from an expensive electric organ, trucked in 100 miles for the occasion, children were told to leave the room in order to shield them from the elect vessel's behaviour. Shame hung in the air as he sucked at a young woman's mouth. She did not respond in kind, and her humiliation was palpable as others watched on in horror. Her husband, feeling unable to defend her against someone so powerful in the church, bowed his head so he wouldn't see what was happening, but he found it impossible to ignore the slobbering kisses to which she was being subjected. This wasn't new behaviour for Big Jim. Through the late 1960s, he would often demand that young women line up after church services for a holy kiss. If any of them refused his advances, she was seen as being out of step with God's will. That Saturday afternoon, as Big Jim took a break from raving at the gathered brethren, Madeline was once more led to his bedroom. The hosts had tried to barricade the hall with furniture to block her path, but she and her husband forced their way through, cracking a large glass door pane in the process. When she came out of the room, she told Gardner that Big Jim had ordered her to say their host was a son of a bitch and a bastard. Gardner felt that he was in an impossible position. The elect vessel could supposedly do no wrong. Later that evening, when Big Jim and Madeline did not emerge for dinner, the distraught host decided he had no choice but to confront the elect vessel. In a letter Gardner wrote a week later, setting out his perspective on what had happened, he explained, I felt I had to find out what was happening in my house. I went through to Mr. Taylor's bedroom and found Mrs. Kerr undressed and in bed with Mr. Taylor. He had on his pajama top, which was open down the front. Big Jim was unrepentant. When questioned by a witness as to whether his behaviour was morally suitable, he simply replied, yes. A horrified Gardner insisted that Madeline and her husband leave immediately. From his perspective, this was in order to protect his house. Big Jim, enraged, tried to follow Madeline into the night, saying, she is my woman. Several brethren men physically restrained the elect vessel. For these Scottish followers, it was a step too far to allow God's voice on earth to chase after a married woman who a short while earlier had been found naked in his bed. In the letter, Gardner described what happened next. JT Jr. became very difficult, calling me bastard, son of a bitch, and to all go to hell. I had to send for Dr. Bill Thompson, who had been attending to him for the last 3 to 4 weeks. JT Jr. became very quiet when Dr. Thompson arrived, and he was given an injection and tablets. Dr. Thompson said that medically he was a sick man, but the moral side is a matter for the priests. Big Jim's son, James Taylor III, arrived in Aberdeen on a 1:20 a.m. flight, having been summoned by concerned brethren to take his father home. A few hours later, the Taylors were on their way back to New York. Just to explain here that this is taken from letters from witnesses who were there and also from emails of people who were there. And there are still people alive who were in the rooms when these things happened. Like, there are still witnesses to the truth of these things. And by and large, the people who are the loudest defenders of JT Jr. around the time of Aberdeen are people who were nowhere near the place. And overwhelmingly, people who were at Aberdeen and people who were close to Aberdeen and people who knew people who were at Aberdeen walked away. Because
Right.
for these people who were there, this was a tipping point.
There's a
And
reason why nearly all of the brethren in Scotland who were in fellowship with him at this point left the church. Like that, it was several thousand of them, wasn't it? Like, and as you say,
Mm.
they were the ones closest to it and who knew firsthand witnesses and who could hear from them. And that's a fascinating point, what you said about those who defend it most loudly were the furthest away from the scene. And also, I might add, they're the ones with the most to lose if people do realise that the great men are fallible.
Mm.
You know?
And I think just to the next bit here to describe how the brethren reacted to Aberdeen in real time. So Ian Arvin is one of the people that I talked to for the book, and the Arvin family were in Aberdeen for the meetings because they had family there. Um, Ian Arvin was recalled home from Aberdeen with his family. His dad had received a phone call from the leader in Peterborough, who demanded they come back immediately and give an account of themselves. When the Arvin family showed up to the Tuesday night meeting, having rushed the 450 miles home, local elders asked whether they supported the supposedly treasonous Aberdeen Brethren. The Arvins were the only ones in the room who had been at the Aberdeen meetings. Ian, his father, and his brother confirmed they stood with the Scottish Brethren. They tried to give an account of why they'd reached that view, but were shouted down from all sides. They were then escorted to the door. Feeling rather shell-shocked, the Arvin family waited outside the meeting room to see if anything else would happen. Over the next few minutes, about 70 people walked out and came over to the Arvins, wanting to know more about what they hadn't been allowed to say in the meeting room. Of course, the Arvins were more than happy to tell them. Most of those 70 Peterborough Brethren were excommunicated for daring to question the purity and holiness of the elect vessel, and only a few returned. And so you can see from this that the Brethren didn't allow even any discussion about what had happened to Aberdeen, even when there were direct witnesses who had been there, who had seen what JC Jr. had said and done, and who, to me, this was one of the places, I mean, among many others, where the Brethren really departed from the scriptural principles that they'd been known for. You know, the whole concept of in the eyes of two or three witnesses, let a matter be established. And around the time of Aberdeen was really where you saw, to some extent, that principle fall away, where it was even when you had direct witnesses who were there in the meeting room with you, it was more important to shut those witnesses down to make sure that they weren't heard, so that they couldn't share their side of the story, because what they said, even as witnesses, was a threat to the version of events that had been circulated by the leadership.
And could you imagine had this gone the other way, where an actual man of God was held accountable? Like, I know that they know that their establishment, their foundation that they stood on, if there was a man of God to actually take some sort of accountability, I mean, the church would not be where the church is today. It wouldn't be this cult that it is today. It's this moment. This is where I get really, really infuriated. And it breaks my heart, because the account of its nature is literally why the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church is the way that it is now, and has such a high level of sexual abuse in every way, shape, or form. And not even sexual abuse, but physical, spousal abuse, right? It's just, to me, this was the pinnacle point, that if they had just stopped and taken accountability, we might have a somewhat form of a mainstream Christian church.
And I think the thing here is that the Brethren in Scotland and the Brethren in Aberdeen didn't just walk away from JC Jr. and the exclusive Brethren. They did try to follow the process of holding him accountable. They sent the tapes over, because they're like JC Jr., he's local in New York, therefore it's the New York Brethren who need to take responsibility for addressing this. And they sent the recordings over to New York, and they sent letters explaining what had happened, and they described in great detail, and left it with the Brethren in New York to take action against what JC Jr. had done. And this was sort of the the acid test really for whether it was possible to hold an elect vessel accountable, and the Brethren in New York tried. And there was massive conflict in the New York meeting about whether they could hold JT Jr. accountable. And so we just pick up the book describing this. The Brethren in New York were responsible for investigating and enforcing assembly judgment, but censoring the elect vessel proved beyond them. He thumbed his nose at them, turning up drunk to meetings in the weeks following the Aberdeen incident, as a New York elder recounted in a letter. At the ministry meeting, Mr. Taylor appeared barefoot, sat alternately clowning and dozing during the hymn, prayer, and words. The brewing storm caught the attention of the press when Big Jim brazenly invited Madeline Kerr and her husband to visit him in New York a few weeks after the Aberdeen encounter. A Daily Express reporter was dispatched to ask the Exclusive Brethren leader for his version of events. Madeline and the elect vessel were found together at his house in Brooklyn, their respective spouses nowhere to be seen. Big Jim was in an armchair, clad only in underwear. He didn't seem bothered to have been disturbed in a state of undress, joking to the reporter that he'd better put some trousers on. But, quite honestly, I find it more comfortable just sitting in my underpants. As the elect vessel...
The stuff is mind-blowing, and I still find it astonishing that you can look up this photograph from this interview,
Yes.
and that it's got those classic things like the whiskey and the Bible.
Yes,
in the hand.
As the elect vessel denied having done anything improper, absolutely nothing happened in that bedroom that Mrs. Kerr and I are ashamed about. He sat on the couch and posed for an astonishing photograph. He looked dishevelled with a glass of whiskey in his right hand and a large leather-bound Bible resting on his lap. He draped his left arm around Madeline's shoulder, resting his hand on her breast, and kissed her lightly on the cheek. I don't care what people say, he told the reporter. She is a very, very pure person. This picture and the accompanying article were the final straw for many Exclusive Brethren in Europe and North America who were already hearing from friends and relatives who had witnessed Big Jim's behaviour in Aberdeen.
This is important. The reason why this is important is not only because that it's this filthy skeleton in the Brethren's closet, but it's because, to be honest, the same thing today, again, different clothing, perhaps on the outside or whatever, metaphor you want to use, but a similar thing could happen in the Brethren now. A similar thing could happen with the current elect vessel, is that he's caught without his underpants on, so to speak. And again, as we know, a similar crisis could happen where, two sides form, one where people go, hang on a minute, where are the witnesses? Where are the facts? What's going on here? Perhaps this isn't what we see. And where the spin doctors kick into operation, where the elect vessel gasp, might even lie. The page before, you describe how the Brethren in New York and around the place challenged him with the recordings where he kept saying bum, bum, boob, tit and stuff, and where he tried to lie and say, oh, the recordings were a fake. And yet, there wasn't enough time or the equipment in that day to actually create a fake in that manner. And the Brethren who knew him listened to it and said, well, no, it is clearly your voice. So quite on top of all of this sexual immorality, he's lying and being caught red-handed lying. And I just want to zero in on that stuff, because I'm like, people, this could happen again. It might not. Maybe Bruce Hales really is the Christ, but maybe he's not, and maybe he too could lie. And I've been told that for a couple of decades now, that in Bruce's ministry, he's been teaching the Brethren, saying, things like, are we prepared for another ambush? And will the Brethren stand with me when there's another ambush? And so he's, in a way, I think, why on earth is he preparing them for an ambush? Has he got something to hide? Is he worried there's going to be a crisis? Is he worried there's going to be a test of his leadership?
This is why Aberdeen is still, after 54 years, still such a massive thing for the Brethren. It's not just about JT Jr. being a filthy old perv, although, I think it's pretty clear that he was, looking back. But this really gets to the heart of whether you are prepared to acknowledge the truth of what happened. And it's why BDH keeps coming back to, if there's another Aberdeen, are you ready to stand with the truth? And 25% of the exclusive brethren worldwide left over Aberdeen. Like massive, massive numbers. It was thousands and thousands of people. And starting in Scotland, where almost everybody left, and then you got further and further out. And it was the people who had been there, or the people who had friends and family who were there, or the people who got letters from people who were there. And the brethren in Aberdeen tried to explain what had happened, and they wrote. The other thing is that the recordings of Aberdeen went to Stowe Hill, I think it was called then, the precursor of the Bible and Gospel Trust. So all of the recordings of meetings got sent in to the Bible Trust to be printed as ministry, and the Aberdeen recordings got sent in to the Bible Trust, and it was Rebecca Stott's father, of course, who was running the Bible Trust at that point. But the people at the Brethren's own Bible Trust responsible for printing the ministry listened to the recordings from Aberdeen, which they had been sent to turn into ministry, and said, hey, something's not right here. And it was the Brethren's own ministry depot that printed the transcripts of Aberdeen and everyone's letters and said, hey, we're not making a judgment call here on whether JT Jr.'s behaviour was okay, but here's the ministry from Aberdeen and here's everyone's letters, and we're just publishing this as a standalone white book so that you can all make up your own minds about what happened in Aberdeen. And this was the Brethren's own Bible Trust putting out a version of their own ministry to the Brethren, and that was banned. And that issue of the White Book was taboo for the Brethren, and Brethren were told to destroy it without opening that White Book. And there were families who ceremonially burned that White Book in their backyard to show what a judgment they had. And it's like, but this was exactly the process that the ministry is supposed to follow. The recordings get sent to the depot prints them, the depot sends them to everyone. So why can't people read this one? And I still, for anyone who's interested, this white book that was put out is still available online. If you want to know what was said, you can look it up. You can go and read it. And at that point, for anyone who was found to have read it, you were instantly withdrawn from.
Unbelievable, eh?
Yeah.
Unbelievable cancellation of attempts to cancel the other narrative.
Yeah.
And you're just making me think it's obviously not anywhere near as such a big scale, but just a reminder as well that the Brethren continue to redact ministry and to redact things that were said that later on they become embarrassed about, or that they don't want to be kind of immortalized in ministry in print. And I think, for example, of the so-called poison ministry that Bruce Hales said about my brother Braden Simmons, which has been talked about on this podcast, on Get a Life podcast, possibly with an interview with Braden, or I might have talked about it in previous interviews. But as an example of that, that ministry where Bruce Hales inquired about the fastest way to kill yourself, and appeared to be saying that it was better for Braden to kill himself than to have contact with an outsider. It appears that that's those are the parallels he was drawing, because he had an extended discussion about it, about rat poison, that the fastest way to kill yourself would be arsenic or rat poison. That stuff was printed in white books and distributed all around the world to every Brethren household, and then it hit the news and the media and the ex-Brethren community, who there was an uproar. And lo and behold, when those meetings were printed in the more hard copy of Bruce Hales's ministry, all of the poison ministry references had mysteriously disappeared, and you would never know that they're there if you take that book off the shelf. oh, there's no such thing as poison ministry. No way, that was never said. And yet those white books still exist, people. We know this was said. We know it happened.
And if you look at the white book version versus the proper, the later official ministry version, there's like 4 or 5 pages that have just disappeared of Bruce Hales's ministry. And it's like, well, he's either God's voice on earth, he's Christ, he can do no wrong, therefore everything he says is God's voice, or it's possible he fucked up and we just need to get rid of it.
And I mean, they truly believe in there, though, that he should be allowed to edit his ministry the way he wants to. And going back to Aberdeen, so he's brought that up a lot recently, is Aberdeen's being brought up again. So he knows, I mean, it was very heavily brought up after we did all those Aberdeen podcasts, but it's coming up again since all this ATO raid has happened, right? Like, he's always got this backup plan to be smoothing things over while chaos is happening. And yes, now we've told, okay, they were supposed to have fellowship meetings in November. Then it was canceled because he's having knee surgery. I guarantee you there is no knee surgery happening. I guarantee you he's dealing with his ATO situation. Like, there's just always just such a way where he smooths things over, gathers the empathy that he needs from the people and from his followers, and keeps moving on. But I do believe he's walking towards his canyon that he's going to fall into.
Interesting. And oh my gosh, well, that, read the bottom of page 145.
Just wrap up there.
Yeah. Read the bottom of page 145, Craig, because it's so relevant.
Yes, so I had started asking questions about Aberdeen because I'd Googled it and found the picture of JC Jr. And we were in Wollongong for fellowship meetings with BDH, and we were talking to him about whether we could advertise in the yellow pages. This was me and Dad. Our conversation with the man of God was uneventful, and Dad was pleased to get special permission to advertise in the yellow pages again. Then, as the man of God manoeuvred into the front passenger seat of a waiting vehicle, Dad threw him an unexpected question. Mr. Bruce, could you say something to set Craig's mind at rest about Aberdeen? I was mortified. Having doubts about Aberdeen was bad enough, but to have them revealed out of the blue to the man of God was so much worse. His reply was succinct. What it comes down to is the absolute folly of ever doubting the man of God in the first place.
And that is how he keeps control of 55,000 plus members.
The absolute folly of ever doubting the man of God in the first place. Wow. Wow. The scene is set, isn't it?
Right. And they all believe.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, not all of them. Some are waking up. A lot of them are waking up in there. Yeah. A lot of them. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so that takes us to the end of chapter 7.
So we're going to end here, and Craig and Lindy are going to join us again and pick up where Craig begins his journey of leaving. And that will be for part 2. And then we'll have a part 3 finishing up the rest of it. So I want to take, thank you so much, Craig. Right. The way that you have laid this out right now for the insiders to get inside your book this way, I know that they are going to appreciate it. Thank you so much, Lindy, for joining us as well. For anyone that is needing help, please reach out to the Olive Leaf Network. And if you're interested in sharing your story, please email us at info.getalife@proton.me. Please remember to comment, like this episode, and check to make sure you have subscribed. Thank you so much, Craig and Lindy.
See you next time.
Until next time, everyone, stay safe and much love to you all.
How can you support Get a Life podcast? You can donate internationally via PayPal at www.paypal.me/getalifepodcast. PayPal also has a QR code that can be scanned. Or donate to our Get a Life podcast GoFundMe.
If you're in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Check out www.get-a-life.net for Get a Life merchandise, books, and ways to support or get support. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.